and could accommodate several dozen passengers. In addition to food and water for the journey, the first settlers would have also carried horses, pigs, sheep, and cattle, along with farming tools and weapons. They wouldn't have needed building materials, as there were some scrub forests of birch that could be harvested. Although it was a hard land, there were some advantages. Along the coasts, there was plenty of pasture land, no predators, and virtually no insects. Seals, walruses, and other mammals were plentiful, and flocks of seagulls, puffins, and great auks nested on the coasts. Vast schools of North Atlantic cod could be found in the nearby waters, and its meat could be frozen and broken into chunks to be consumed on long sea voyages. Fruits, grains, and vegetables all had to be imported, a vulnerability the Vikings never solved, but it was possible to carve out a home of some sort. One settler, Aud the Deep-Minded, illuminates the power a woman could hold in Icelandic society. She was the wife of Olaf the White, co-ruler of Dublin with Ivar the Boneless. After her husband and son died, Aud outfitted a ship of 20 men and captained it herself, managing the impressive and highly praised feat of landing with crew and cargo intact. When she arrived, she claimed a huge plot of land, freed her slaves, and divided the property between herself and them. She acted as a clan chief, presiding over her own hall and its celebrated feasts. As a mark of the respect she was held in, she was given a complete Viking ship burial when she died. Nowhere else in Europe at the time would a woman be allowed to own land, much less rule over it. This limited equality was possible because the harsh conditions created a society that was both rugged and stubbornly independent. Most of the settlers had come to Iceland to escape being told what to do or to find a new life, and they didn't intend to create a new tyranny on their free island. This was a remarkable experiment, a kind of frontier republic on the fringes of human existence. There were no towns or cities, no army or taxes, no king, and virtually no government. There were only isolated farmsteads, extended families living together in groups as small as 15 and as large as several hundred. When mediation between individuals was needed, both parties turned to the local Gothi, a man who was respected for his reputation, knowledge of the traditional law, and his generosity. Despite the respect he was held in, the Gothi was no chieftain. The Icelanders were very conscious of creeping despotism, and were determined to stop it. The Gothar were not lords or nobles. Theirs was not a hereditary position, and if they failed to do their job adequately, they were replaced. There were no peasants and nobility. All free men were equal. When group decisions needed to be made for a local area, it was done in the ancient Germanic manner of a thing. The free Icelanders would gather at an assembly and vote, with the majority carrying the day. If there was ever a need for foreign policy, or a decision affecting the whole island, a great assembly called the Althing would meet. Each farmstead would send a representative, and again a simple vote would determine the outcome. The closest thing they had to a national figure was the law speaker, a particularly respected Gothi who was elected for a 3-year term. Each year he would stand on a special rock at the Althing and recite from memory 1/3 of Iceland's laws, with the other Gothar around him making sure he didn't make an error. Any Icelander who wanted to announce the settlement of a farm or a marriage or a business contract would do so here, in the presence of the assembled freemen. The feat of memory, being able to recite the entire law code, was a testament to both the simplicity of Iceland's laws and the capability of Icelandic memories. This was a skill perfected during the long Arctic nights, when there was nothing to do except weave entertaining stories to pass the time. During the Viking Age, Iceland's main export was its poetry. Icelandic skalds, traveling poets, became famous for their ability to bring tales of Viking heroes to life. Any king or would-be adventurer had to have a skald on hand in their hall to tell of their exploits. Many Icelanders found fame and even wealth by telling their stories across the Scandinavian world. The island was resource poor, but it had a society that only the Vikings could have pulled off. Since travel across the interior was impossible in some places, the only way to maintain contact and a sense of mutual identity was by sailing around the coasts. Life was certainly hard, but the idea of a self-regulating society was wildly attractive. Iceland held out the promise of good land where a lowly Norwegian or Irish Viking could settle and live as a jarl without having to risk life and limb fighting fierce Anglo-Saxon or Celtic opponents. Within a generation, it had filled up. 50 years after Ingolfur Arnarsson's landing, the population had risen to around 10,000, and there was no more available land to claim. Iceland remained a popular destination, especially for exiles from Norway, but its initial promise had dimmed. Men began looking out to sea again, perhaps following schools of fish further and further from shore in little journeys of discovery. Glimpses of misty land masses far to the west began to filter back, and there were always restless men who found even Iceland's frontier society too constricting. For them, the lure would always be westwards. Chapter 13. The Western Isles. It is best to search while the trail is new. Edda of Saemund the Wise. The discovery of further islands to the northwest was a replay of the discovery of Iceland itself. Tradition holds that the first Viking to sight fresh land was the Norwegian Gunnbjorn Ulfsson in the early 9th century. He was caught in a storm on a trip from Norway to Iceland, and after a long journey saw previously unknown rocky islands that he named after himself, Gunnbjorn's Skerries. He also caught sight of a much larger landmass to the west, but when he reported his findings, no one was interested since Iceland still had available land. Nearly a century later, Iceland was becoming overpopulated, at least by Viking standards, and in 978, Snæbjörn Galti decided to go and search for Gunnbjorn's mysterious land and colonize it if he could. After putting together a crew, he sailed to Gunnbjorn's Skerries to gather information about what lay beyond. By this time the Skerries were thinly populated with men who wanted to escape the crowds of Iceland, and they confirmed that there was indeed something to the west. Snæbjörn's persistence paid off, and a few days' sailing brought him to the eastern shore of Greenland, a massive volcanic island larger than all of Scandinavia put together. He set up his colony, but disaster struck almost immediately. The site he chose was a difficult one, since the eastern coast of Greenland is largely not suitable for human habitation. More damaging, however, was the internal quarreling, which soon had the colonists at each other's throats. Some violent argument erupted. The precise issue was unknown. Both sides drew weapons, and Snæbjörn was killed in the fighting. Without its leader, the colony collapsed, and only 2 survivors returned to Iceland. Although the attempt at the colonization of Greenland had been a spectacular failure, it had proved that the new land existed and could be reached from Iceland. Only 4 years later, a second attempt succeeded. This time, the expedition was led by a hot-headed Norwegian named Erik Turvasan, better known as Erik the Red. Recklessness seemed to run in the family. His father, Turval, had been exiled from Norway for manslaughter, and Erik continued the family tradition a few years later, getting banished for the crime of some killings. He fled to Iceland for refuge and claimed a farm on the northwest coast, hoping to settle down. Everywhere he went, however, trouble seemed to follow. At his first farmstead, 2 of his slaves inadvertently started a landslide and damaged some of his neighbor's property. In the ensuing demands for payment, Erik killed a man, the delightfully named Eyjolf the Foul, and was forced to flee again. This time he settled on one of the islands off the coast of Iceland, safely out of reach of Eyjolf's kinsmen. His new farm was even less successful than the first. Within a short time he was again quarreling, this time killing not only his neighbor, but the man's sons as well, a crime which finally got him exiled for 3 years. Erik was running out of places from which he could be banished, and he clearly needed a place without existing laws. So he bought Snæbjörn's ship and the services of the surviving crew and headed west. The old sailors managed to repeat their earlier trip, and Eric spent the 3 years of his exile exploring the coast, looking for a suitable spot for a colony. Rounding the icebound southern tip of what is now Cape Farewell, he discovered 2 habitable fjords on the western coast at roughly the same latitude as Iceland. Eric was probably not aware that he had reached an island, since the ice floes prevented him from sailing around it, but he noticed that there were no predators, either human or animal. Convinced that he could make a colony work, he sailed back to Iceland and began to recruit settlers. Like all good salesmen, Eric recognized the value of publicity, so he called the new land Greenland to make it more attractive. The pitch worked dramatically, as more than 500 Icelanders agreed to make the trip. This was due, at least in part, to Eric's powers of persuasion and his description of Greenland's plentiful reserves of fish and fowl. The old lure of an empty land for the taking certainly played a part as well, all the more so because the days of claiming good land in Iceland were gone. The island was beginning to show the first unmistakable signs of ecological decay. In the search for ever more pasture land, the settlers had cut down all the birch forests, and the deforestation was starting to erode the uplands. Not only was there no new land, but some of the newest farms were failing as the soil deteriorated. In 985, Eric set off with 25 ships, loaded down with all the supplies needed to start a new life on the frontier. The journey was a difficult one, and those who went knew they were risking everything in a 1,000-mile journey through stormy seas. 18 of the 25 made it to Greenland, and when they pulled up their ships on the beach, there was probably a palatable sense of disappointment. Now they discovered by just how much Eric had oversold the place. If Iceland was barely habitable, Greenland was downright hostile. Lying mostly above the Arctic Circle, it was at the very edge of the technical and survival abilities of the Vikings. While there was plenty of land, the 840,000 square miles of Greenland makes it the largest island on Earth, nearly all of it was uninhabitable. A vast glacier covers the interior, leaving only a bleak, mountainous strip of coast, barely 50 miles wide. There is almost no timber or iron, and the warmer months are too short for growing wheat or other staple crops. If they ran out of any vital supplies, they would have to import it from Iceland, a difficult and unreliable prospect in the 10th century. Fortunately, there was enough marine life available to supplement their diets. Luxury goods like sealskins, walrus ivory, and the fur of Arctic fox, hares, and polar bears could all be harvested in small amounts. They were in high demand in markets at home, and could even be brought to the continental centers of Europe. The colonization got off to a good start. Eric had probably selected a spot for himself during his 3 years of exile and knew exactly where to go. He planted his farm at the head of several long fjords and called it Brattahlid, meaning the steep slope. It was an exquisite estate, protected from the frigid Arctic waters by the banks of the appropriately named Eriksfjord. It still boasts some of the best farmland in Greenland today. The maze of necks and islands in the fjord allowed enough meadowgrass to start raising stock animals, the Viking version of wealth, and the rest of the settlers spread out around him. Thanks to some clever Viking innovations like using irrigation as cold protection for their crops, the colony eventually swelled to 4,000 inhabitants. So many settlers arrived that a decision was made to establish a second colony 170 miles to the northwest. Eric was naturally chosen as the Gothi of the eastern settlement and established a meeting house for an island-wide thing at Brattahlid. In the summer months, when the warmer weather made travel more palatable, some of the colonists would journey nearly 1,000 miles to the north in search of walrus, seals, and beached whales to harvest. These voyages resulted in enough of a yield that, even accounting for the vagaries of sea travel, Eric became a wealthy man. Trips back to Iceland and Norway were not frequent, but enough ships made the voyage in both directions that contact was maintained. In addition to the continuous trickle of immigrants who had left Scandinavia and found Iceland overcrowded, there were also relatives who would come to visit or colonists who gave up and returned. Although Eric himself never left Greenland again, his children inherited his wanderlust and made several trips back to the homelands. By his wife Thjodildr, Eric had at least 3 sons, the oldest of which, Leif, made the dangerous crossing from Greenland to Norway in the summer of 999. The purpose of his visit isn't known, but he brought his wife as well, perhaps intending to settle there. He managed to find employment with King Olaf Tryggvason as a member of the royal bodyguard. Olaf had need of such men because he was in the middle of a campaign to forcibly Christianize Norway, and there was considerable resistance. The king ultimately failed in his attempt and lost his life in the bargain, but he made one important convert. Sometime in the winter of 999, Leif accepted the new faith and was baptized together with his wife. Before he died, Olaf convinced Leif to return to Greenland as an evangelist and spread Christianity. Leif agreed, but on the return trip was caught in a storm and blown badly off course. When the winds died down and the fog lifted, Leif caught sight of land but was confused when he saw heavily wooded hills instead of the barren, rocky coast he was expecting. Realizing that he was somewhere west of Greenland, he turned around and sailed in the opposite direction. Unknowingly, Leif Erikson had glimpsed the New World. His attention for the moment, however, was the afterlife. When he reached Brattahlid, he set about the business of conversion, starting with the eastern settlement. He found an eager audience for his message, but success came at the price of splitting his family. His mother, Theodildur, became a devout Christian, but his father, Eric the Red, a proud pagan, was horrified. Tensions escalated further when Theodildur built a church at Brattahlid and informed her husband that she would no longer sleep with him until he abandoned his gods, a tactic which the sagas inform us was a great trial to his temper. Fortunately for familial relations, Leif announced a new project that diverted attention from the religious dispute. There was an undiscovered country to the west, and he was going to explore it. He invited his father along. Eric's success in Greenland had made him a sort of good luck totem, but the patriarch, already in failing health, declined. Leif Erikson was not the first Viking to spot the Americas. That honor belonged to Bjarni Herjolfsson, son of the second most wealthy inhabitant of Greenland. Herjolf had been one of the original settlers, a close companion of Eric in Iceland. He had done quite well for himself there, but had been unable to convince his son Bjarni to join him on the island. This was probably because Bjarni was already a successful merchant in Norway and had no desire to start over on an overcrowded island. He did agree, however, to visit his parents each year, a promise he appears to have kept. In 986, however, when he arrived in Iceland for his annual call, he found no trace of his father, just a rumor that he had left for Greenland. Bjarni immediately decided to go after him, but was faced with a serious navigational problem. Neither he nor anyone else in Iceland had been to Greenland, or even knew how to get there, beyond the vague understanding that it was to the west. There was no map, no compass, not even a description of what the colony looked like. Nevertheless, he set out with a volunteer crew, and, not surprisingly, got completely lost and overshot his goal. His first glimpse of land was of rolling hills covered with trees, a sure sign that he was in the wrong place. To men used to Iceland and expecting Greenland, the sight of so many trees was astonishing. They were everywhere, a vast, unbroken green carpet from the edge of the beach to the gently sloping hills in the distance. The Norsemen named it Markland, Treeland, and continued north, not wanting to stop and explore. They next came to an island dominated by curious flat stones so large that 2 men could lie heel to head without touching the edges. The only sign of life they saw were the polar foxes that darted away from the ship when they neared the shore. The Vikings called this Helluland, the land of flat stones. Again, Bjarni didn't allow exploration of the island because he was anxious to find his parents. This time his sail caught favorable easterly winds, and after 4 days they finally reached Greenland. Bjarni was reunited with his father and, probably not willing to go through the harrowing journey again, decided to stay on the island permanently. His story of a new country to the west was treated as a curiosity, but there was little interest initially in pursuing it. Even Bjarni was content to let the issue drop. He was a trader, not an explorer, interested in cargoes and profits, not setting up colonies or fighting off natives. When his father died some time later, he inherited the estate and settled down to a life of farming. A decade later, when Leif Erikson announced his intention to sail west, Bjarni still had no interest in going along, but he sold Leif his ship and pointed him to the surviving members of his crew, most of whom signed up for the expedition. All told, there were 35 men, a large number for a single vessel. This was to be a journey of exploration, both to find a suitable place for a colony and, more importantly, to find a source of raw materials. If the land were really as tree-rich as Bjarni claimed, then all of Greenland's resource problems were solved. Although Leif was not aware of it, the very survival of Greenland's colonies were also at stake. Chapter 14. Vinland. Be warned by another's woe. Njal's Saga. The land he was looking for was tantalizingly close. On a clear day, a man could climb the highest mountain of the western settlement and, provided he knew where to look, could see the cloud banks in the gray subarctic sky that touched the North American continent. The crossing would be much easier for the Vikings than going back to Iceland, and Leif had the advantage of veterans who knew the way. He decided to sail Bjarni's route in reverse. The old crew had no trouble retracing their course, and with a few days of easy sailing, they cast anchor off the coast of Helluland. Leif and a small group rowed ashore, but after a quick survey realized that the land was unsuitable. There was no grass and virtually no plants of any kind, just a gradually sloping hill of slate that reached all the way to the glaciers, which they called ice mountains, in the distance. Returning to the ships, Leif and his men had a brief discussion and decided to sail south to see if they could find better land. To the southwest, they caught sight of the heavily wooded hills and white beaches of Markland, but again decided to keep exploring. 2 days later, they spotted an island, and since the weather was good, rowed ashore. The sight of wild green grass was a welcome change to the frozen coasts they were used to, and in the first rush of excitement of men who had been cooped up on a ship too long, they claimed the dew was the sweetest thing they had ever tasted. As soon as they had found a safe place to beach their ship, Leif and his men disembarked with their hammocks and began work setting up a camp. Although it was only the beginning of autumn, they decided to spend the winter there, and Leif proposed a plan for systematically exploring the land around them. The men were split into 2 groups of 16, with Leif floating between them. Each day, one of the groups would go out in a different direction while the other would stay at camp. The only rules were that the men were not to go so far that they couldn't return the same day, and they were to stay together at all costs. The island, probably modern Newfoundland, was overflowing with abundance. Not only was there virtually unlimited timber, but the salmon in the rivers were both larger and in greater numbers than they had ever seen before, and the forests were teeming with game. The winters seemed milder. Leif claimed that there was no frost, and there was enough wild pasture to support farm animals without the need to make hay. Most astonishing of all, the Vikings noticed that winter days had more hours of sunlight here than they did in Iceland or Greenland. This was a rich country, ready to be exploited. The most exciting discovery, however, came after Leif and his men had settled into a routine. One evening it was discovered that Tyrker, Leif's foster father, had gone wandering off from the main group and had lost his way. The distraught Leif immediately gathered a search party of 12 men, but just as they were setting out, Tyrker appeared. He was obviously in good spirits and announced that he had made a discovery. He had found some type of wild wheat growing and had then stumbled across some wine berries. The word he used has traditionally been translated as grapes, which has led to confusion since grapes don't grow that far north. The Vikings, however, referred to any berry as a wine berry. Tyrker had probably come across cranberries or gooseberries. Either way, the Norsemen immediately started fermenting them into a heady wine and got rather drunk toasting themselves in their new find. From that time on, the focus became gathering supplies to return home. The two groups no longer went exploring. Instead, one gathered berries, while the other cut timber and loaded it on the ships. The new country, named Vinland by Leif for its berries, was far superior to Greenland or even Iceland. Not only was it lush, but it was also apparently uninhabited. When they had gathered as much timber as they could carry, they shoved off, towing their rowboat, now filled to the gunwales with berries, behind them. They had several days of fair wind, and when they were approaching the skerries off Greenland, Leif spotted several figures clinging to the rocks. Sailing closer, he recognized that it was a group of marooned sailors from Iceland who had missed Greenland and crashed into the treacherous rocks. Somehow he fit the 15 survivors on board, and even managed to salvage the remains of their cargo. Given the relatively small number of colonists on Greenland, the absence of anyone sailing in their direction, and the sheer implausibility of someone stumbling onto their tiny skerry, the men had given themselves up for lost. The appearance of life out of the vast ocean, arriving within the rapidly diminishing window of time they could survive, won him the sobriquet Leif the Lucky from the grateful sailors, and they spread the story throughout Greenland. Leif undoubtedly intended to go back and found a colony, but didn't get the chance. Sometime before, probably during the winter, his father Eric the Red had died. There is some doubt about the cause, but in 1002 some fresh colonists from Iceland had brought the plague with them, and Eric was probably one of the many who died. The colony needed a leader, and Leif was the natural candidate. His duties prevented any new trips west, and he never again set foot on North American shores. The responsibility for further exploration and colonization fell to his siblings. As a sign that he was passing the torch, Leif gave his ship to his brother Thorvald, and the latter gathered volunteers to start a colony. He was not quite as charismatic as his father or brother and only managed about 100 people, but hopes were high as the expedition set off. At first all went well. Thorvald found Leif's old camp without difficulty and spent the winter fishing and gathering timber. In the spring, he equipped a boat and began to explore the western coast, taking careful notes on possible settlement sites. As he investigated one island just off the coast, however, he discovered a wooden hut that looked like it had been used to store grain. It was clearly not Viking workmanship, but there was no other sign of human habitation, so Thorvald and his men returned to their camp. It was a slightly disturbing finding. Someone had obviously discovered this land before them. The only question was if they were still there. The answer was provided the next summer, when Thorvald explored the opposite direction. A sudden squall drove their ship onto the beach, damaging the keel. Not wanting to stay there, they limped along until Thorvald spotted a suitable harbor. The site was pleasant enough to encourage Thorvald to think it would make the perfect site for a colony. As they walked back to the ship, they noticed 3 mounds on the beach that hadn't been there before. On closer inspection, they turned out to be canoes, each with 3 strange-looking men hiding beneath. A short struggle ensued where 8 of them were captured, but one of the strangers managed to escape in a canoe. None of the prisoners understood Norse, so the Vikings called them skrælings, screamers or screechers, for the strange noises they made. After they had killed the captives, they climbed a nearby hill to look around, and noticed what looked like the huts of a small village in the distance. While they had been exploring, the skraeling, who had escaped, returned, this time with a countless fleet of canoes. The two sides attacked each other, but after the first clash, the skraelings fled. The only Viking casualty was Thorvald, who had been struck with an arrow in the armpit. He managed to pull it out, but the wound proved fatal, and his men buried him, with some irony, on the same beach that he had wanted to make his home. Thorvald's expedition had been reasonably successful, but his loss, he has the dubious distinction of being the first European killed in North America, crippled the survivors' morale. They spent that winter gathering wood and berries, and as soon as the weather improved, they returned to Greenland to report what had happened. By this time, it was clear that if Leif and his father had been lucky, the rest of the family was decidedly less so. The thought of Thorvald's body moldering in some distant land was too much for his siblings to bear. So the youngest brother, Thorsten, decided to retrieve it. He set out with a crew of 25, but as soon as they were out of sight of land, they got hopelessly lost, drifting for almost a month. When they were finally driven to shore in early winter, they discovered that they were still in Greenland, having only made it as far as the western settlement. The rest of the crew found homes among the other settlers, but Thorsten and his wife wintered on board their ship, a brutal experience that cost Thorsten his life. After his death, there was no one willing to take up the cause. If salvaging Thorvald's body had lost its luster, at least Vinland still remained tantalizing. The need for timber, pasture, and resources was a constant concern, and the western land promised a nearby solution. So, in the summer of 1009, Leif sanctioned a second major attempt at colonization. The expedition was led by Leif's brother-in-law, Thorfinn Karlsefni, who had married the dead Thorvald's widow, Gudrid. There was always a supply of people looking for greener pastures, and Thorfinn seems to have recruited volunteers by highlighting, among other things, the alcohol that could be made with the abundant wine berries. This turned out to be a popular pitch, as more than 200 people enlisted to join him, making it necessary to outfit 3 ships to fit them all. Among the passengers was Leif's half-sister, Freydis, an illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, who had inherited more of his fiery temper and dominant personality than any of his sons. Not wanting to miss the wealth or reputation that could be gained by the trip, she had browbeaten her reluctant husband into joining, and was determined to make him one of the leaders in spite of himself. Once again, the Vikings found Leif's old camp, and moved in to exploit the nearby resources. That first winter was a particularly brutal one, killing off most of the livestock that they had brought with them. Morale was not improved by the conspicuous lack of berries. They were able to gather enough to make a small brew, but it was hardly the lavish banquets of wine that they had been promised. Virtually the only bright spot in that harsh winter, at least for Thorfinn, was that his wife Gudrid gave birth to his first child. The boy, named Snorri by his father, was the first European born in North America. When spring arrived, the colony began to split up. One group returned to Greenland, while the rest relocated to a different site. Thorfinn built a stockade, probably because he was aware of Skraelings in the area, but they seemed peaceful enough. After a while, a group showed up wanting to trade, which Thorfinn was happy to do, with the exception of weapons, which he forbid any Norseman to sell on pain of death. The bartering was conducted amicably, but 3 weeks later, a huge number of Skraelings suddenly burst out of the woods and attacked the stockade. They quickly overran the walls, but were brought up short by 2 unusual sights. The first was the Vikings' penned-up bull, the lone male survivor of the previous winter, that was now agitated and bellowing fiercely. The Skraelings had never seen such an animal before and were suddenly uncertain. The second sight was probably equally terrifying. The Vikings had been caught by surprise and were wavering between resisting and fleeing. Out from her sleeping quarters, however, had come Freydis, and she stood, sword in hand and bellowing like a Valkyrie, rallying the Vikings. They formed a makeshift shield wall and charged, scattering the Skraelings. The colony had been saved, but it was only a matter of time until it was attacked again. Thorfinn tried to avoid this by relocating, but once again the winter was brutal, and the colonists gave up. Even Thorfinn was exhausted, unwilling to stay longer. As soon as the weather cleared enough to sail, they all left. Freydis' thoughts on the matter aren't recorded, but judging from her next actions, she was probably disgusted that her kinsman had given up. Clearly, if there was going to be a new colony set up, she would have to do it herself. Her husband, as usual, was no help. He lacked both the imagination and energy to gather a crew. Fortunately for Freydis, the same summer in which she returned to Greenland, 2 brothers had arrived with a crew from Norway. She invited them to her home, and spent the summer plying them with stories of the easy wealth available to the West. It took less than a month for the 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, to sign on. They agreed to provide a ship, And to make sure that there was an equitable division of whatever they found, all three agreed to a limit of 30 men per vessel. Relations between them broke down immediately. The brothers arrived at the camp first and installed themselves in life's old hall. When Freydis angrily protested, they pointed out that she had cheated by concealing 5 extra men on her ship. Insults started flying back and forth until Helgi and Finnbogi took their crew and moved to a different location. By the time winter set in, relations were so strained that the two camps stopped communicating with each other. Freydis decided to eliminate her rivals in a typical Viking fashion, equal parts ruse and brutality. Early one morning, she walked to Finnbogi's longhouse and offered to make amends with him. She had decided to leave, she said, and was wondering if he would sell her his ship, as it was slightly larger than hers. Finnbogi generously agreed, and Freydis returned to her own camp. When she climbed back into her own bed, her cold feet woke up her husband, who wanted to know why she had been outside. She proceeded to tell him that she had gone to make peace with the brothers, but that they had beaten her instead. Egged on by Freydis, the husband angrily gathered all his men and stormed into Helgi and Finnbogi's camp. They were taken completely by surprise. Everyone in the house was seized, bound, and then dragged out in front of Freydis, where they were killed. The only exception consisted of 5 women, who the men refused to kill, no matter how hard Freydis pleaded. She taunted her husband mercilessly for his weakness, but when he still refused, she grabbed an axe and butchered them herself. The grisly deed may have been gratifying for the formidable Freydis, but it doomed the colony. There were simply too few to sustain another winter, let alone a permanent settlement. She and her husband returned after threatening to kill any man who talked about what happened, and the Vikings never again attempted a settlement in the New World. There is evidence that they did periodically return to gather raw materials. An Icelandic annal records a voyage in search of Vinland in A.D. 1121, and more than 2 centuries later mentions a journey to Markland to harvest timber. The failure to establish a permanent base, however, also doomed Greenland. The island was simply too rugged and sparse to support a European-style existence based on animal husbandry. There was not enough pasture, wood, iron, or farmland available. Vinland would have solved this problem nicely. At the narrowest point of the Davis Strait, less than 200 miles separates Greenland from Baffin Island. Beyond lay a vast continent, teeming with greater resources than Iceland, Europe, and Scandinavia had to offer. But the Vikings simply had too few people to establish themselves against a determined native population. This failure threw the Greenland colony back on its tenuous lifeline of long-distance trade with Scandinavia. As long as Viking sea kings ruled their vast northern empire, that was at least possible. But even by the 11th century, the trade routes were beginning to shift. As Greenland began to grow more isolated, the climate started to deteriorate. Starting in the mid-14th century, global temperatures began to cool, further reducing the island's arable land. The glaciers advanced, and the Inuit crossed over from what is today northern Canada and began to push south. The last years of Greenland's Viking colonies were not pleasant. A cluster of skeletons exhumed from the western settlement reveals a picture of a dying civilization. Half of those who survived to 18 died before age 30, and the average height of both men and women is less than 5 feet. Famine began to be more common. The Icelandic Audiobook claims that the old and helpless were killed and thrown over cliffs. Communication between the two settlements declined as temperatures cooled. After years of hearing nothing, an Easterner named Ivar Bardason tried to contact the long-silent western colony. He wrote in his diary that he found no people, neither Christian nor heathen, but many sheep running wild. The surviving eastern settlement struggled on a bit longer. It was decimated by the Black Plague, and in 1379 the Skrælings, Inuit, raided it, killing 18 and carrying off 2 boys as slaves. The last record we have of anyone living is the hauntingly short mention in an Icelandic annal. In the year of our Lord 1410, Sigrid Bjornsdotter, married Thorsten Olafsson. After that, Icelandic ships stopped going west, and there was only silence. The colonies of Greenland were sustained by trade, and ironically that lifeline was cut by other Vikings. A source for the luxury goods that the remote island provided, the ivory, pelts, and sealskins, was found much closer to the Scandinavian markets in what is today Russia. There was no need to risk life and limb on harrowing journeys across storm-tossed seas. All the exotic goods a rich sea king could ever want were to be had to the east. The Traders. Chapter 15. Rurik the Russ. They are as tall as date palms, blond and ruddy. Ibn Fadlan, describing Vikings. Unlike their Scandinavian cousins, who pointed their longships down the coasts of Frisia and the British Isles, the Swedish Vikings looked in the other direction, to the vast forest zones across the Baltic Sea. As early as the mid-8th century, 40 years before Norwegian raiders had attacked Lindisfarne, the Swedes began to explore the river systems of western Russia. What attracted them was not plunder, but trade. There were no rich monasteries or unprotected towns, just expansive birch and pine forests, and beyond them the grass steppes of the east. The Vikings came at first to exploit raw materials, honey and wax from the Finns living on the Baltic, and Arctic furs and amber from the Lapps to the north. The Slavic populations who lived in the interior of what is today Russia could offer little in the way of plunder, but were valuable as slaves, to be used in Scandinavia or sold in the busy slave markets of the south. The Vikings were joined in these early slave raids by the Finns, whose name for Sweden, Ruotsi, became corrupted to Russ, the name by which the Swedes in the east eventually came to be known to the Islamic and Byzantine worlds to the south. The Vikings, regardless of which area they hailed from, were people of the water, and it was by lakes and rivers that they penetrated what is now Russia. In A.D. 753, they took over the outpost of Staraya Ladoga. The fort sat on the edge of Lake Ladoga, near the mouth to the Volkhov River, and gave access to the two great river systems of Russia, the Volga and the Dnieper. Both rivers led to an abundant supply of silver and silks, two things in high demand back in Scandinavia. The Volga pointed east to the Islamic world, while the Dnieper led south to Orthodox Byzantium. The Dnieper route was extremely treacherous, and the Russ are the first people we know of who successfully navigated it. It required sailing south from the main Rus base of Staraya Ladoga, then up the Volkhov River to pick up the headwaters of the Dnieper. The 570 miles of river that followed were broken up by a series of 12 dangerous falls that necessitated dragging the ship out of the water and carrying it, cargo and all, to a more navigable spot downstream. This exposed the traders to attack, a daunting proposition since the area was inhabited by the Pechenegs, a terrifying tribe of 8 hordes who specialized in ambushes. If a merchant survived the river, he would still have to navigate the shores of the Black Sea, an additional 350 miles away from Constantinople. The Volga route, by contrast, was far simpler and therefore preferable. It led by gentle stages to the Caspian Sea, and from there to the wealthy markets of Baghdad. There was a tremendous amount of money to be made, but in this case it was by trade, not by raiding. The Rus were far from home, and they could only operate on the Volga by permission of the Khazars, a powerful tribe that dominated the southern end of the river, where the Volga delta emptied into the Caspian. The Khazars were a semi-nomadic people, originally from Central Asia, who had converted to Judaism in the 8th century. They commanded all trade on the southern Volga from their capital of Atil, a city near the Caspian Sea. The Khazars provided an emporium for the northern goods that the Swedes brought, but more importantly, they gave the Rus access to the far more lucrative markets of the Muslim world, where the Rus could sell their slaves. The bulk of these unfortunates were acquired by the Rus from the Slavic populations of present-day Russia, and were destined for the markets of Baghdad. The scale of this slave trade and its profitability can be glimpsed by the amount of silver that made its way back to Sweden. More than 10,000 Islamic silver coins have been found in various hoards, surely only a fraction of what was acquired. The Arab geographer Ibn Rushd claimed that slaves were virtually the only thing the Rus cared to import. They sailed their ships, he wrote, to ravage the Slavs. Arab opinions on the Rus were mixed. There was no doubt that they were magnificent specimens. The traveler Ibn Fadlan claimed that he had never seen people of more perfect physique. They are tall as date palms, blond and ruddy, he wrote. But he also considered them the filthiest of God's creatures, at least by Islamic standards. By this time, the Rus were beginning to act like the Khazars. Not only did their chieftains surround themselves with concubines and ape the dress and ceremonies of the Khazars, but they started describing themselves as Khans. By the mid-9th century, however, signs of trouble along the Volga route began to appear. Thanks to religious rifts, cultural stagnation, and several civil wars, Baghdad entered a period of decline. And as the silver dried up, the Rus began looking for other ways of making money. Characteristically, they resorted to the old habit of raiding, and fell on the Islamic populations near the Caspian Sea without mercy. A Muslim chronicler wailed that the Rus shed blood, ravished women and children, plundered, destroyed, and burned. Then the people prepared themselves for war, but the Rus attacked them, and thousands of Muslims were killed or drowned. If Baghdad's power was waning, however, that of the Khazars was not, and any raid had to have their permission first. This was made abundantly clear in an infamous raid carried out in AD 913. A large Rus fleet, according to an Islamic source it was 500 ships, sailed down the Volga and cut a deal with the Khazars to split evenly whatever spoils they found. After pillaging several cities on the southern coast of the Caspian, the Rus turned north and advanced into a strange, burning land. After 3 days' travel across the surreal landscape, they sacked the city of Baku in present-day Azerbaijan. They found enough plunder to satisfy even the most avaricious Rus. Not only was Baku a major source of naphtha, one of the main ingredients of Greek fire, fuel for the war machines of Byzantium and Moorish Spain, but it was also a religious center. Not far from the city was a geyser of natural gas, which at some point in antiquity had been ignited. The fire-worshipping Persians had built a temple, which over the years had attracted a tidy pilgrim trade from as far away as India, and was responsible for much of the city's wealth. The raid was a dramatic success, but was remembered less for the haul of slaves and gold and more for what happened on the return journey. When they reached the Volga, the Rus were ambushed by their Khazar allies and slaughtered. The disaster illustrated the dangers faced by the Rus even in war bands. They were far from home and as likely to be victims as raiders. The deeper problem, however, greater than any double-cross, was that the Volga trade was showing diminishing returns. There also seemed to have been troubles closer to home. The Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century work written in a monastery near Kiev, records that in the mid-9th century, several Slavic tribes drove the Rus out of their strongholds around Lake Ladoga. It continues, rather improbably, to suggest that the Slavs then fell into a civil war, and after several years of fighting invited a Viking named Rurik to rule over them. This unlikely story is our first introduction to the man who would eventually be known as a founding father of the modern states of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine. By 862, a Viking named Rurik, a form of the Norse name Erik, had installed himself south of Ladoga at a fortified market town he called Holmgard, better known today as Novgorod. From his capital on the Volkhov River, Rurik sent 2 of his nobles, named Askold and Deer, south to secure access to the Dnieper. On the west bank, where the ground rose to a prominent bluff, was the city of Kiev, dominating the river below. It served as a frontier outpost of the Khazars, and by sending his men to take it, Rurik was reorienting the Rus toward the south, a change which would have important ramifications for both Russian and European history. The dangers of the southern route were well known. The Russ would have to cross more than 800 miles of hostile territory, at times frighteningly exposed to aggressive tribes and treacherous conditions. But if the risk was much greater, so was the reward. At the end of that journey was the city of Constantinople, at the time the greatest metropolis on earth. In an age of poverty, it was a city of gold. While the capitals of the West counted their populations in the thousands, Constantinople's population was nearly 1 million. It was the physical and spiritual center of a realm that stretched back into antiquity. No mere kingdom, it was the eastern half of the fabled Roman Empire, the final unblemished jewel in the Roman crown. It was ruled over by an emperor who was still called Caesar by a population which still called themselves Roman. Both emperor and empress still presided in style over chariot races in an ancient Roman hippodrome, as their predecessors had for 5 centuries. The empire's borders stretched from the island of Sardinia off the coast of Italy to the Black Sea and the northern coast of what is today Turkey, and were still defended by its formidable legions. It was, to medieval eyes, a place of wonders. The great land walls, the most formidable defensive fortifications ever built, were pierced by 9 main gates, the most famous of which was the ceremonial Golden Gate. It was a vast Roman triumphal arch with 3 huge doors, lined in gleaming precious metal and surmounted with statues of elephants pulling a victorious chariot. Beyond it lay a wide avenue lined with palaces of white marble, vast forums and bazaars overflowing with exotic wares from 3 continents. Everywhere one looked, there were splendid mosaics and breathtaking works of art from the vanished world of antiquity. Public squares held famous classical statues, while golden and porphyry sarcophagi held the remains of legendary emperors. Most awe-inspiring of all was the great cathedral of the Hagia Sophia that dominated the city's skyline. There was no building like it in the world. In an age of squat, heavy architecture, the Church of Divine Wisdom rose in graceful, elegant lines. A worshipper who entered through its enormous imperial door, a portal encrusted with silver and supposedly made from the wood of Noah's Ark, would gaze in wonder at the multicolored marble walls and an interior space that beggared imagination. The massive central dome, the largest in the world for 1,000 years, rose 180 feet above the floor, and the ceiling was covered with 4 acres of gold mosaic. Around the base of the dome, the builders had put windows lined with gold. As light flooded into the building, this made it appear as if the dome itself were insubstantial and merely floating, as if, wrote one of the first observers, it was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. If these wonders weren't enough to fire Russ' greed, there were always the busy marketplaces. In the 6th century, the Byzantines had smuggled the secret of silk-making out of China by sending 2 monks to tour a Chinese facility. After learning the intricacies of the trade, the clerics had managed to sneak some silkworms into hollow bamboo canes, with enough mulberry leaves to keep them alive on the return trip. When they arrived in the capital, they planted the city's first mulberry trees, and Constantinople's most profitable business was born. The silk that the Russ had bought in Baghdad had been imported with the usual price increases along the way. In Constantinople, however, there was no middleman to add to the cost, greatly increasing the profit the Russ could get when they resold it at home. The route there was dangerous, but the Russ were free to develop it without asking permission from anyone, and having done so, they would reap all the rewards. Constantinople, called Mclegard, the Great City, by the Vikings, was obviously worth braving treacherous rapids and fighting barbarians along the way. The Russ had probably been aware of its existence for some time. The first recorded contact is of a Russ delegation in 838, and the sight of such wealth must have stunned them. The walls probably did as well. The city was protected by a triple line of defenses. The first was a moat nearly 66 feet wide and 23 feet deep, reinforced with a 7-foot stockade. If an attacker managed to get past that, they would have to climb over a 30-foot outer wall, while defenders could strategically withdraw through numerous minor gates. The last line of defense was the most formidable. a massive inner wall towering 40 feet high and 20 feet wide, broad enough to rush whole companies of men wherever they were needed. This final wall was reinforced with 96 towers, allowing the defenders to fire their lethal bolts from nearly 360 degrees. With adequate troops manning them, the walls were quite impregnable. To most, defenses of this magnitude were intimidating. The Russ apparently considered it a challenge. Constantinople might be the greatest city on earth, with defenses that had shrugged off 400 years of attacks, but it was also built on a peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water, and water was their element. The attack was coordinated from Kiev, where Askold and Deer had been gathering and equipping a fleet of some 200 ships. When they reached the Black Sea, they found it completely unguarded and managed to slip along its coast, unnoticed by any Imperial patrols. On June 18, 860, just as the sun was setting, the Rus fleet drew up before the massive walls of Constantinople. Whether by good fortune or careful planning, they had timed the attack perfectly. The Emperor was away, and the city sat virtually undefended. Chapter 16. Mclegard. The terror and darkness robbed you of your reason. Patriarch Photius. In its long struggle with Islam, the Byzantine Empire was finally starting to see the tide turn. This was due to both the temporary decline in the strength of the Caliphate and the careful stewardship of a series of emperors who had taken halting steps toward recovering some of the territory lost during the previous 2 centuries. The current dynasty had been reaping the benefits of this resurgence, but had been less than successful on the battlefield and was eager to fend off the whispers of cowardice. When the opportunity came to gain some ground on the Arab frontier, therefore, the emperor, Michael III, better known to posterity as Michael the Drunkard, marched out to fight the Muslims. He quite sensibly took a large part of the navy with him. For all their power on land, the forces of Islam had not mustered a corresponding naval strength, and the imperial fleet could be used to resupply the army while it hugged the coasts. They were leaving Constantinople undefended behind them, but in all the years of the city's existence there had never been a credible threat from the Black Sea. When the Rus fleet arrived, the shock was overwhelming. It was as if a wolf had suddenly materialized inside the sheep pen. As far as the Byzantines knew, the northeast was a trackless wilderness, an effective barrier to the hostile tribes beyond. There were no cities or population centers capable of supporting an army, and no dockyards on the coast for building a fleet. And yet here were strange ships with dragon prows and menacing warriors where no ship should ever be. With the emperor and most of the armed forces away, the task of defending the city fell to the Patriarch Photius. The city seemed paralyzed. As Photius later recounted, "Like a thunderbolt from heaven, the terror and darkness robbed you of your reason. You, who have captured many trophies from enemies out of Europe, Asia, and Levant, are now threatened by a spear held by a brutal barbarian hand, which would make a trophy of you." As the Rus looted the unprotected suburbs outside the walls, the stricken population could only watch in horror. Those who couldn't get out of the way were cut down or drowned, as the Rus put their homes to the torch. From the imperial harbor, the citizens could see the Rus fleet wheeled towards the islands off the coast. The Prince's Islands were used both as spiritual retreats and prisons for exiled political prisoners. They had served as the final home of several blinded emperors and currently held Photius' predecessor. When the Rus landed, they found to their delight that there were also plenty of monasteries nestled among the rocks. The several weeks it took to loot the entire chain of islands gave Photius the time he needed to mount a defense. The Patriarch was a remarkable man. Not only was he arguably the most erudite man to fill his post, but he was also an adroit political animal. His first order was to summon the monks guarding the city's holiest relic, a cloth worn by the Virgin Mary, and have them parade it around the city walls. While this had no discernible effect on the Rus, it did give a needed boost to the morale of the populace by reminding them that the city was under divine protection. It certainly seemed as if it was. What happened next is unclear, since our only contemporary source is silent, and later chronicles are garbled. Most likely, several imperial ships arrived on the scene and, with the help of a convenient storm, managed to scatter the Norsemen. The Russ withdrew to the Black Sea in disorder, ending the expedition. The Russ had seen just how formidable the city's defenses were. Their failure to attack the city despite the absence of the army is a testament to how impressed they were. They were also concerned about the Imperial Navy. This was the first time that the Russ had ever come across a power that was capable of matching them at sea. They would have to either attack it in greater numbers or gain access to its wealth as traders and mercenaries. For their part, the Byzantines were also shaken. The attack had served as a diplomatic wake-up call. There was a new power to the northeast that had come out of nowhere, and it had to be brought to terms. Byzantine ambassadors were sent speeding to Kiev, and a treaty was agreed to, allowing the Rus to trade inside Constantinople. If that had been the goal all along for the Rus, as it may indeed have been, it was a brilliant success. On this triumphal note, the shadowy Rurik the Rus disappears from history. He had founded the first centralized state, or at least received credit for it, and would become the great ancestor of Russian dynasties. For the next 7 centuries, aspiring leaders would gain credibility by how close they could tie themselves to his house. The future of his state, however, was not in Novgorod, where he had ruled. His successor, Helgi, relocated to Kiev and took the title Great Prince of the Rus. For the first few years, he concentrated on imposing his rule, expanding south and gaining control of the prosperous trading towns along the Dnieper. By 907, he felt secure enough to undertake the major campaign of his reign, an attack on Constantinople. Unlike the earlier probing strike, this one was a full invasion with the full support of a prince. Helgi had made a careful study of the habits of the Imperial Navy and skillfully managed to avoid it, reaching the outskirts of the city unopposed. The mouth of the Imperial harbor was blocked with a huge iron chain, so Helgi walked his men overland and used 2,000 canoes to cross over to the north side of the city. If any spot of the land walls was vulnerable, it was the northeastern district, where they dipped into a valley. Helgi brought his army there, cheekily hung his shield on the gate, and waited until the Imperial army appeared. This was a magnificent bit of saber-rattling. Helgi wasn't foolish enough to think that they could overwhelm the most formidable walls in Europe without siege equipment. His predecessor had demonstrated that the Rus were capable of commanding a threatening fleet, and Helgi had now shown the strength of an army he could put in the field. What he really wanted was a formal treaty granting his merchants favored status, and the imperial government decided that it wasn't worth the nuisance of denying him. Specific terms were laid out for how Rus merchants could operate, and they were given a privileged quarter in the city. The Rus were exempted from certain taxes and duties, although what they could sell was strictly regulated. The Byzantines even agreed to give them access to the city's baths. Most importantly, however, the Rus were given the opportunity to serve as mercenaries. This would, in time, grow to be their main occupation in the East. The Rus had found in Byzantium the only state in medieval Europe that was financially organized enough to regularly pay mercenaries, and this employer, as they were to find out, paid extremely well. A succession of emperors used Viking soldiers, both the Rus and fresh recruits from Scandinavia, to great effect. The most famous was the Emperor Nikephoros Phokas, who, in 961, launched an attempt to reconquer Crete from the Muslims. 3 previous tries had been made with disastrous results, but Nikephoros, a brilliant general, had brought with him a complement of Vikings. He used them to storm the beach, and so thoroughly intimidated the defenders that they refused to engage in another battle. After a 9-month siege of the capital, they surrendered. It was a mistake, however, to think that Byzantium and Kiev were at peace. The lesson the Rus took from the Treaty of 907 was that they could renegotiate better terms by invading every few years. Helgi's successor, Ingvar, better known by the Slavic version of his name, Igor, launched 2 attacks on the city in 941 and 944. In both cases, the Russ suffered horrendous casualties, largely due to a mysterious superweapon known as Greek fire. It was a naphtha-based liquid, which would ignite on contact, and had been a state secret of Byzantium since its invention in the 7th century. The closest the Byzantines got to explaining it was Emperor Leo the Wise's laconic description that it was fire prepared with thunder and lightning. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok had run into a version of it when they had raided Muslim Spain, but that was undoubtedly not as effective as the real thing. The Byzantines would store it in clay pots and lob it at ships, igniting the decks as the vessels shattered, or use flamethrowers mounted on their prows to spray it at opposing ships. Since it was oil-based, water only made the situation worse. It would spread out in a slick over the surface, setting fire to anyone who jumped overboard. The Byzantines used their weapons sparingly, but they knew how to deploy it to devastating effect. During Ingvar's attack, the Imperial fleet used submerged brass tubes to burn the Russ ships beneath the waterline. To an eyewitness, it looked as if the very sea had caught fire. The Russ, he wrote, seeing the flames, jumped overboard, preferring water to fire. Some sank, weighed down by the weight of their breastplates and helmets. Others caught fire. It took almost a century of costly failures for the Russ to understand that they couldn't take Constantinople by storm or ruse. Despite the trauma that these repeated assaults caused the citizens, there was something in the dogged persistence that impressed the Byzantines. They became the mercenary of choice. And in 988, the Emperor Basil II created a special corps that would in time become the most famous and profitable employer of the Vikings in the East. In 988, Basil was in desperate need of effective soldiers and was on the brink of losing his throne. Although of peerless lineage, he claimed descent from Constantine the Great. The 30-year-old Basil II was facing a massive revolt by Bardas Phocas, one of the empire's most capable generals. Although he would eventually emerge as one of the empire's most ferocious warriors, in 988 he was still new on the throne, with an unreliable army and a skeptical court. The rebel general marched through Asia Minor unopposed, sacking any town that displayed loyalty to the emperor. When he reached the shore of the Bosporus, the narrow strip of water that separates Asia from Europe, he had himself crowned emperor, complete with imitation diadem and the purple boots of the Imperium. The population, sensing the way the wind was blowing, hurried to offer their congratulations and support. By one account, the rebel army was now twice the size it had been when it set out. Basil, whose one previous military campaign had ended in an ambush, had only the few troops in Constantinople and a nearby field army of questionable loyalty. Things looked bleak, but the emperor kept his head. Even before the rebel army had reached the shore, his ambassadors were speeding towards Kiev. Ingvar's grandson, Vladimir, was only too happy to receive them, and he made an audacious offer. In exchange for 6,000 Viking recruits from Scandinavia, he wanted to marry Basil's sister, Anna. The ambassadors probably returned to Constantinople believing that they had failed. In the long history of the empire, a princess of the ruling dynasty had never been given to a barbarian. The proposition itself threw the court into an uproar. Not only was Vladimir a barbarian, but he was a staunch pagan to boot, who had slaughtered his own brother, raped his sister-in-law, and usurped the throne. He already had 7 wives, and over the years had collected some 800 concubines. Even in an emergency, he was not the type to be given a chaste Christian princess. The court, and poor Basil's sister, may have been outraged, but the emperor was determined to have the extra troops. He agreed to the deal, adding only the stipulation that Vladimir had to accept Christianity and give up some of his more scandalous behavior. Both sides were as good as their word. Vladimir was baptized, the protesting bride was shipped north, and 6,000 hulking Vikings arrived at Constantinople. Basil wasted no time. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped across the thin strip of water separating him from the rebel army and landed a few hundred yards from the main enemy camp. At first light he charged, driving them toward the beaches. The rebels didn't stand a chance. Stumbling out of their tents half awake and undressed, they were confronted with a horde of screaming Vikings swinging their massive battle axes. So many were slaughtered that before long the Vikings were doing their work ankle-deep in gore. Those who managed to escape the carnage had the equally horrid fate of being burned alive. As they fled the ruins of their camp to the water's edge, a squadron of Imperial ships blanketed the beach with Greek fire, immolating everyone. The victory both secured Basil on his throne and convinced him, if there were any remaining doubts, that he had been right to sacrifice his sister. Another man would have thanked his mercenaries, paid them off, and dismissed them. But Basil had other ideas. The years of turmoil had convinced him of the necessity of overhauling the Byzantine army, and he intended to use these Vikings as a new core around which to build it. The Norsemen were loyal to gold, and there was no finer paymaster than Basil. They took an oath of allegiance to the throne, after which they became known as Varangians, the men of the pledge. In times of peace, they served as the royal bodyguard, and in times of war as shock troops. They were the empire's premier fighting force, successor to the ancient Praetorian Guard of Rome, and they fought the empire's battles from Syria to Sicily. To an ambitious Scandinavian, there was no surer way to find wealth than through service with the Varangian Guard. Signing up with the emperor ensured regular payment and the chance to raid far-off lands without the rigors of planning. These campaigns not only offered a better chance of survival than traditional plundering, but were extremely lucrative. One Byzantine source even claims that when an emperor died, the Varangians were entitled to one trip to the treasury, where they could have whatever they could personally carry away. Over the next few centuries, some of the most famous Vikings from across Scandinavia would spend some time under arms in the Varangian Guard. Kings of Norway, princes of the Russ, Irish jarls, and Icelandic berserkers all found prestige and wealth in tours of duty. Often men who went on to other careers considered their time in the south among their greatest accomplishments. Being part of a successful campaign gave one tremendous cachet with both sexes. Bali Balason, a hero of the Icelandic Laxdala saga, is described returning from Greece like some new Adonis. Wherever he and his men took lodgings for the night, the womenfolk paid no heed to anything but to gaze at Bali and his companions in all their finery. Evidence of the Vikings in Byzantium is littered throughout the south. In Athens, they carved runes into the side of a marble lion that guarded the city's port of Piraeus, and in the Hagia Sophia, at least 2 bored guardsmen carved runic graffiti into the parapet of the second-floor balcony. The price of service can also be found recorded in runes. Many stones in Scandinavia bear the inscription Var Daudri Grecium, died among the Greeks. Some never returned because they found life in the warm climates of the south preferable. Enough axe-bearing barbarians settled in Constantinople to qualify for their own quarter, often serving the throne from father to son. As the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena wrote more than a century after Basil, "As for the Varangians, who bear on their shoulders the heavy iron sword, they regard loyalty to the emperors and the protection of their persons as a family tradition, a kind of sacred trust and inheritance handed down from generation to generation." As time went on, however, the Guard began to change. After 1066, there was a great influx of Anglo-Saxons who were trying to escape the heavy yoke of the Norman conquest, and the Viking recruits began to dwindle. By the early 14th century, the Viking element had almost completely vanished. There was more to this change than just the arrival of different conscripts. The Russ themselves were different. It was more profound than a simple break with their nomadic raiding past and the adoption of a settled lifestyle around fortified cities. Although they still thought of themselves as Vikings, or at least of Scandinavian descent, the beginnings of something brand new was beginning to appear. The Russ were becoming Russian. Chapter 17. The Pull of Byzantium. If a wolf comes among the sheep, he will take away the whole flock unless he is killed. Russian Primary Chronicle. In some ways, it's surprising that the Russ held on to a Viking identity as long as they did. The original Viking raiders that had plied the waters of the Volga and the Dnieper had always been a minority population. The vast area they conquered, from Novgorod in the northwest to Kiev, the current capital of the Ukraine, was populated by Slavs, while the Scandinavians were no more than a privileged military caste. They took local wives, and although a constant stream of immigrants from Sweden would have slowed the process, gradually they began to merge identities with the Slavic population. The slow evolution is represented in the names of the princes of Kiev. Helgi was followed by Ingvar, sometimes rendered as the Slavic Igor, who was followed by the purely Slavic Sviatoslav and Vladimir. As the names began to change, the dress and habits followed. A Byzantine chronicle provides a physical description of Sviatoslav during a visit with the Emperor John Tzimiskes in 971. Sviatoslav is described as more of a Slavic Khan than a Viking sea king. He came rowing in a Viking boat, pulling the oars along with his men like a good Viking, but there the northern comparison stopped. He was of only medium height, with light blue eyes obscured by bushy brows and a snub nose. His head was completely shaved, except for a topknot on one side, which was braided as a sign of his noble status. He wore a simple white tunic, indistinguishable from those of his men except for its cleanliness, and wore no decorations other than a dangling gold earring in one ear. This process was sped up by contact with Constantinople. A treaty in 945 had thrown open the gates of Constantinople to the Russ, exposing them to the great lure of Orthodox civilization, and it was their eventual adoption of Christianity which, more than anything else, marked the great transition from Russ to Russian. It needed time to take root, and was not fully embraced for several generations, but it locked the nascent Russian state to the Byzantine cultural orbit. Ironically, it was the great Russ defeat by Greek fire in the 940s that had indirectly paved the way for Christianity. Prince Ingvar had returned to Kiev badly weakened by the attempt to take Constantinople. Several of the surrounding tribes which had fallen under Russ domination took the opportunity to revolt, and Ingvar was forced to expend most of his energies putting them down. The most troublesome of the client states were the Drevlians, an Eastern Slavic tribe that inhabited part of what is today the Ukraine. When news reached them of Ingvar's defeat, they took the provocative step of ceasing all tribute payments to Kiev. Ingvar couldn't immediately respond, pressed as he was by other concerns, so the Drevlian issue was left to fester. When Ingvar had finally stabilized Kiev, he sent the Drevlians a demand for the back pay they owed, with threats of retribution if they should withhold even a small amount. The delay in addressing the problem, however, had given the Drevlians the impression that Ingvar was powerless, so their prince, Mal, responded with words to the effect that an equal does not pay tribute. The Prince of Kiev immediately set out with his army for the Drevlian capital of Izkorostan, now the modern Ukrainian city of Korostan, and at the sight of the massed troops, Mal's bravado evaporated. Formally apologizing to Ingvar, he handed over the gold that was owed. A wiser ruler would have left it at that. But on the way back to Kiev, Ingvar decided that the Drevlians hadn't been punished enough. Defying his authority had to have a higher price. Ordering his men to continue on to the capital, he turned back with his bodyguards. When Prince Mal was informed of the demand for more gold, he stalled by claiming to need to inspect his treasury to see if the funds were available. When he asked his advisers what to do, one supposedly offered, "If a wolf comes among the sheep, he will take away the whole flock unless he is killed." Mal heeded the words. At his sign, a group of Drevlians burst out of the gates, massacred Ingvar's guards, and captured the Prince of Kiev. According to a Byzantine source, the grisly revenge Mal took was one the Vikings could appreciate. Ingvar was held down on the ground while two young birch trees were bent toward him. Each of his feet was secured to a tree, and then the saplings were released, ripping the unfortunate man in half. Having a leader cut down in the prime of life was a nightmare for any medieval society. It usually left a young successor, and if a regent didn't grab control firmly, all the attendant horrors of a civil war. This would indeed have been the fate of Kiev, since Ingvar's only son was only an infant, if it had not been for his remarkable wife, Olga. Not only did Olga have the loyalty of the nobility of Kiev, but, according to the colorful account given in the Russian primary chronicle, she was also a more effective leader than her late husband. The news of Ingvar's death was followed closely by a group of 20 ambassadors from Prince Mal with a proposal of marriage. The request was not quite as outlandish as it at first seemed. Royal widows were among the most eligible wives of the medieval world. They would frequently look to remarry quickly to avoid upheaval, and such a marriage offered the chance of a dramatic rise in political fortunes for ambitious suitors. What was unseemly was the boldness of the ambassadors. Mal rationally assumed that a newly widowed Olga would be feeling vulnerable and open to suggestion, so instead of tactfully ignoring his part in her husband's murder, his emissaries openly admitted it. When they were shown into her quarters, they told the grieving widow that Ingvar was like a ravening wolf who deserved to be killed. Now, they continued, Olga had the chance to marry a real prince. Surprisingly, she seemed open to the idea. Her husband would not rise from the grave, and how he died was not as important as the fact that he was dead. Olga said she needed a day to think about it, but strongly hinted that this was only a formality. Pleased with her pragmatic approach, the ambassadors withdrew to their camp, agreeing to visit her the next morning. As soon as the Drevlians had gone, Olga ordered her men to dig a deep ditch just behind her citadel. By the morning it was finished, and when the ambassadors arrived, dressed in their finest clothes as a token of respect to the woman who was about to become their princess, Olga had them seized, dragged past her citadel, and buried alive. Even as her servants were leveling the earth of the mass grave, Olga sent a message to Mal. She would gladly marry him, she said, but only if he provided a grand enough escort. The 20 ambassadors he had already sent were an insufficient honor guard for a woman of her status. She would arrive in state with the most noble men of Iskorostan, or not at all. Prince Mal, perhaps impressed by her sense of decorum, eagerly sent the leading men of the city with as sumptuous an honor guard as he could afford. When they arrived at Kiev, Olga was the model of civility, offering the use of her own private bathhouse to wash the dust from their long journey. When they were all safely inside, however, Olga had the door barricaded and then set fire to the building, ignoring the agonized screams. As the embers flared, she calmly sent a final message to Mal, requesting that she be allowed to conduct the customary funeral feast for her dead husband when she arrived at Iskorostan. The prince, still unaware that anything was amiss, hastily agreed. When he saw her approaching the city with a large group of retainers, he rode out to greet her, asking where his ambassadors were. She replied that she had been so excited to meet him that she had ridden ahead, and that the rest would soon join them. Satisfied, the prince escorted her into the city to a great feast that had been prepared. Olga gave every appearance of the joyful bride, but had carefully instructed her men not to touch a drop of alcohol, a prescription that neither Mal nor his soldiers noticed. When the Drevlians were deep into their cups, the lethal widow gave a signal, and her guards drew their swords, butchering all of their bleary-eyed hosts. Cutting their way out of the city, Olga and her retinue joined her army, which was hiding nearby, and reappeared before the walls of Iskorostan. The terrified inhabitants, now without their prince or leading men, begged for mercy, and to their immense relief, Olga agreed. Her terms were surprisingly modest. Instead of honey or furs, the usual stuff of tribute, she asked only for some birds, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. Unfortunately for the Drevlians, this was an old Viking trick. When she got the birds, she had her men attach rags dipped in a flammable material to the feet of each bird. When they were lit, the panicked animals returned to their nests, lighting the houses on fire. Before long, the wind had turned the scattered flames into a raging inferno. The panicked citizens came pouring out of the ruined gates into the waiting arms of Olga's army. They showed no mercy. Those who weren't slaughtered on the spot were rounded up and sold into slavery. Only in the morning, with Iskorostan a blackened, deserted ruin, was Olga finally sated. Whether or not Olga was as cold-blooded as the legends make her out to be, she was certainly an effective ruler. The Russian primary chronicle notes with succinct admiration that, although she was a woman in body, she possessed a man's courage. Her shrewdness not only kept the throne safe for her son, but also increased its authority. Regardless of the numbers of Drevlians left alive, the message that Kiev's new ruler was not to be trifled with quickly spread. To her credit, Olga chose not to govern with the sword. Although focused on revenge, she was not blinded by it, and was shrewd enough to realize that forcing Kiev's client tribes to pay a tribute each year built up murderous resentment. The gold usually came out of each chief's personal hoard, lessening his ability to reward his men, and thereby weakening his authority. This virtually ensured that the moment Kiev's grip slipped, there would be a rebellion. To convert the chiefs from potential enemies to firm allies, she abolished the hated payment, replacing it with a simple tax on every household. The local leaders, freed from the financial burden, were then allowed to handle all minor administrative or legal issues. No longer would Kiev rule by fiat. Olga had, in effect, transformed rebellious allies into full members of her government. Her regency also saw the construction of numerous trading centers, as well as the first stone buildings in Kiev, Novgorod, and Pskov. The system she devised worked remarkably well and provided a firm foundation for Kiev's continued growth. Olga spent the rest of her son's minority successfully dodging marriage proposals and steadily building up Kiev's power. As successful as the regency was, however, Olga seems to have been aware of a lingering problem. No matter how politically integrated she made the various tribes, they still saw themselves as different from the inhabitants of Kiev. There was no underlying unity beyond a common ruler, no big identifying idea that could turn the people of individual cities into a unified state. In an attempt to rectify this, Olga took the boldest move in a career full of them. She traveled to Constantinople around the year 955, ostensibly to shore up trade relations, but in reality to officially adopt Christianity. The ceremony was carried out in the Golden Church of the Hagia Sophia, with the Emperor Constantine VII standing in as her godfather. As a token of respect, Olga took the Christian name of Helena after the emperor's wife. Her personal conversion may have helped to seal an alliance and perhaps squeeze more trade privileges out of Constantinople, but Olga was quickly disabused of any notions that her people would follow suit. There was a small Christian community in Kiev, but the vast majority of her subjects were pagan, worshipping a variety of Viking, Turkic, and Slavic gods. The aristocracy, in particular, were vocal supporters of Thor, and instead of uniting them behind her, she risked undermining the stability that she had worked her entire regency to maintain. Olga did her best to spread the new faith, bringing Bibles, priests, icons, and vestments back with her. She ordered the construction of several churches in multiple cities and publicly attended them, but all to no avail. The aristocrats, particularly the new arrivals from Sweden, violently resisted, as did most of her family. Her son, Sviatoslav, refused to even consider it, informing his mother that the gentle virtues of patience, forgiveness, and mercy were hallmarks of a feeble religion that would see him mocked by his own men. Olga may have failed to establish Christianity in her son's generation, but she did at least plant the seeds for it to take root in the next one. Sviatoslav, in a conscious rejection of his mother's conciliatory policy towards Byzantium, carried out the last major Rus attack on the empire. While he led the army overland, yet another sign that the old Viking ways were dying out, he left his mother in charge of Kiev, as well as of the education of his three sons, Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. She performed both tasks admirably, although the latter would take several years to manifest. The last glimpse we get of her, fittingly enough, is once again acting as a military commander. When a group of raiders invaded in 969, she organized a vigorous defense, which managed to drive them off. She died a few months later, having lived a life more suited to a Valkyrie, a Viking deity that rewarded bravery in battle, than a saint. Her reign marks the beginning of a great watershed in European history. By converting to Christianity, she had chosen to align Kiev with Europe instead of Asia, to look west instead of east. The Viking roots of the Rus were gradually supplanted by Byzantine ones, and Kiev would drink so deeply from Constantinople's cup that the three modern states which claim descent from the House of Rurik, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, continued to see themselves as the heirs to ancient Greece and Rome. Olga may not have been responsible for all of this, and in fact may have died considering herself a failure, but the Orthodox faith she championed would one day give her people the common identity she envisioned and make possible a vast empire. Chapter 18. From Rus to Russian. Every king of Europe marries a princess of Kiev. Russian Primary Chronicle. As much as Sviatoslav admired his mother, he ordered that she be buried according to Christian custom as a sign of respect. There appeared to be little danger that Odin or Thor would have to give way in Kiev. His immediate neighbors may have been falling like dominoes. Poland, Denmark, Norway, and Hungary all had or were about to accept Christianity, but Sviatoslav was aggressively pagan. Thor demanded victory, and only victory would keep his nobles loyal. His first advance, while his mother still lived, had been against the Khazars, whom both Olga and Ingvar had tacitly acknowledged as their overlord. In a brutal 6-year campaign, he annihilated their forces, culminating with the sack of Atil, their capital city. Clearly, he had inherited his mother's vindictive streak. The city was smashed beyond recognition. The 10th century Arab writer Ibn Hawqal, who visited the ruins shortly after, remarked, "No grape or raisin remained, not a leaf on a branch." The triumph inspired Sviatoslav to try to conquer in the west, and he savaged his way through the Balkans, adding present-day Bulgaria to his domain. Within his first 10 years on the throne, he had carved out the largest state in Europe, stretching from modern Romania to Kazakhstan. It was a vindication of the old gods, dramatic evidence that the All-Father was more powerful than Christ. A clash with Byzantium, the great bastion of the new faith, was inevitable. But unfortunately for Sviatoslav, Byzantium was at that moment in the midst of a revival. The scholar emperor who had baptized Sviatoslav's mother had been replaced by the militant John I Tzimiskes. In a series of sharp strikes, the new emperor drove the Rus back, pinning Sviatoslav inside an old Roman fort on the Danube. After more than 2 months of a siege, the Prince of Kiev surrendered, humbly rowing across the river to meet with his counterpart. The Emperor John met with him on top of his favorite white charger, dressed in golden armor, with the heavy Byzantine crown on his head. He accepted the offer of peace on the condition that the Rus pulled their forces out of the Balkans and abandon the most recent of Sviatoslav's conquests. Worse humiliation was to follow. On the return trip to Kiev, while attempting to negotiate one of the dangerous rapids along the Dnieper, a group of barbarians ambushed Sviatoslav. They had probably been bribed by the Emperor John to do so, an indication of just how nervous the Rus made the Emperor feel. Sviatoslav's head was cut off and made into a drinking cup as a warning to the Rus in any future dealings. Sviatoslav's death threw Kiev into chaos. It was made worse by his sons, who began a slow-burning civil war that lasted for nearly a decade and forced the youngest brother, Vladimir, to flee. Although the Rus were well on the way to becoming fully Slavicized, they still had strong Viking contacts, and Vladimir chose Sweden as his place of exile. There he was greeted by relatives who helped him pick a Swedish princess for a wife and agreed to raise an army to overthrow his brother. With several hundred Swedish and Norwegian Vikings at his back, it didn't take long for Vladimir to seize most of the important Rus cities. He dispatched his brother and offered to share power with him. When Jarl Polk arrived to discuss terms, his men were ambushed, and he was cut down by Vladimir's soldiers. Not content to simply take his brother's crown, Vladimir rode to the convent where Jarl Polk's wife had taken refuge. The abbess tried to protect her by barring the gates, but Vladimir had his men hack through them with their axes and send them surging through the cloister to find her huddled in a room. After she had been violated by Vladimir, he forced her to marry him to lessen the resistance of his nobles to the new regime. As a political ploy, the marriage worked, so Vladimir repeated it 6 more times, collecting along the way, if the Russian sources are to be believed, 800 concubines. He divided these among his major cities, so that wherever he traveled, he would have a range of female company. His prodigious appetites were matched with even greater ambition. He expanded and secured his borders by crushing the tribes inhabiting present-day Slovakia and forced both the Lithuanian and Bulgar tribes to recognize him as their overlord. The success both increased his prestige and made his neighbors nervous. King Boleslav of Poland hurried to sign an alliance with the Russ warlord to prevent him from moving toward the Polish border. The most gratifying recognition of his power came in 988, when the Emperor Basil II sent his request for 6,000 Varangians, offering his sister's hand in marriage in return. The stipulation that he convert to Christianity first probably didn't bother Vladimir too much. Paganism had its downsides for an aspiring autocrat, since the crowded pantheon of Slavic and Nordic gods all too accurately reflected the political realities of Vladimir's territory, where every prince had a fortified citadel and could declare themselves independent. Odin may have been the All-Father, but he was certainly not all-powerful, and like the Prince of Kiev, could easily get drowned out by 100 other petty gods. Vladimir had already tried to address this by promoting Thor as the supreme deity, but this ploy had failed miserably. In Kiev, he had built a huge temple to house both the Slavic and Viking gods, and had placed a wooden carving of Thor in the center. This was taken as a slight to the other gods, and in the uproar that followed, 2 men were killed. Vladimir stubbornly kept to his worship of Thor, but it was a losing battle. This unease with paganism is reflected in a curious story in an early Slavic chronicle with the wonderful name of Tale of the Bygone Years. Convinced that he needed a new religion, Vladimir sent envoys to find out about the world's major faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Islam was rejected because of its taboo against alcohol, not to mention the less than thrilling prospect of being circumcised as an adult. Judaism was dismissed as well because the Jews lacked a homeland, a powerful argument to the medieval mind. That left only Christianity, and the choice to follow either Western Catholic doctrines or Eastern Orthodox ones. That decision became an easy one once his diplomats returned from their missions. The Western ones had gone to the Holy Roman Empire and found squat, dark Romanesque churches. Those in the East, however, had attended a full divine liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. "We didn't know," they breathlessly reported to Vladimir, "if we were in heaven or on earth. We only knew that God lived there." The story may be apocryphal, but it captures something of Vladimir's decision. Kiev was already moving toward Byzantium and away from the lure of the East. Christianity, particularly the Orthodox version, was far more attractive than his native paganism. It had only one God, and an all-powerful one at that. Byzantine autocracy was modeled on this belief in divine authority. Just as there was only one God in heaven, there was only one emperor on earth. God didn't need permission from his angels or their cooperation. He spoke, and things happened. This was the model that Vladimir wanted to impose on Kiev. There were also other reasons to draw closer to Byzantium. He was acutely aware of the limitations of his own power and the deep roots of the great empire to his south. However strong he might appear to be right now, the campaigns of his father had taught him an important lesson. The Rus couldn't sustain the type of warfare in the Balkans that the Byzantines could. They lacked the organization, the bureaucracy, and the hierarchy to really impose themselves. Without changing that, Kiev's power was ephemeral, and it would suffer the fate of countless other kingdoms of the East, vast today and vanished tomorrow. The conclusion to which Vladimir came, to convert to Christianity, was the realization that he could accomplish far more as an ally of Constantinople than as a Viking sea king. With that step, he spiritually and culturally cut the ties with his Viking heritage. A cynical observer, and there were many of them in Vladimir's time, would say that his conversion was purely a political move. But strange as it may seem, he appears to have been genuinely changed. The man who had raped his own sister-in-law now organized daily food drives for the ill and destitute. He laid out his own table for the sick, and when told that some were too ailing to make it, he arranged for wagons of bread, fish, vegetables, and mead to be taken to them. He dismissed his non-Byzantine wives and his small army of concubines and, ironically, considering the amount of blood that he had spilled, abolished the death penalty. Schools were founded in several cities, and a part of each year's tax revenue was set aside for alms. Judging by Vladimir's children, the effort to increase literacy was a dramatic success. His amorous activities had resulted in quite a few daughters, which he proceeded to marry off to the various crowned heads of Europe. So many were exported that the ambitious men of Kiev grumbled, undoubtedly under their breath, that there was a shortage of eligible brides. "Every king of Europe," went the complaint, "marries a princess of Kiev." Part of the attraction was their learning. Vladimir's daughter Anna married King Henry I of France, and she was familiar enough with the court bureaucracy to act as regent for their son Philip. A document dating from early in her regency was well stocked with the customary crosses and marks of noble French witnesses that couldn't sign their own names. Only one signature graces the vellum: Anna the Queen, written in proud Cyrillic characters by her own hand. Not all of the old Viking traits disappeared, however. Vladimir intended for Kiev to be a Christian city and would not tolerate dissent. His first action upon arriving in his capital was to burn down the temple he had made to the old gods. The carving of Thor was tied to a horse's tail and dragged down to the Dnieper River, where it was symbolically beaten with clubs and then thrown into the water. The entire population of the city was then driven down to the river, at spear point, for a mass baptism. On the ruins of his pagan temple, Vladimir built a great church in imitation of those in Constantinople. He named it St. Basil, after the Christian name he had adopted, and spent the rest of his reign strengthening the clerical infrastructure of Kiev. By the time of his death, no less than 7 bishops were needed to administer the spiritual life of the kingdom. Perhaps the most profound effect of Vladimir's conversion was that it brought with it the Cyrillic alphabet. Vladimir needed to use a written language, and Viking runes were unsuitable for long or complex texts. His adoption of Cyrillic opened the Rus up to the deep literary tradition of Constantinople and further cemented cultural ties with the empire. When Vladimir's son, Yaroslav, issued Kiev's first law code, he did so in Cyrillic and based it on Byzantine and not Viking precedents. Physically, the kingdom centered around Kiev even began to look like its southern neighbor. Byzantine craftsmen and artists flowed north, and the wooden halls of the Vikings were replaced by stone buildings. Under Vladimir's stewardship, nearly every town got brick and marble gates in imitation of the imperial city, and stone churches with onion domes to mimic the arched roofs to the south. Under Vladimir and his son, Russia's market towns swelled to real cities with populations over 60,000. The inhabitants were Slavs, who were no longer seen as targets to be raided, but as Christian subjects to be protected. Even the Viking way of life based on animal husbandry was abandoned in favor of agriculture, and cavalry replaced the shield wall. A sentimental connection to the north remained. Both Vladimir and his son hosted Viking sea kings, but they had clearly begun to think of themselves as distinct. They no longer used the Norse language or even Viking names, and within a generation they even began to view the Swedes as trading rivals instead of allies. Within 100 years of Vladimir's death, the Viking imprint on the east had all but disappeared. Despite the role they played in founding the first centralized state, virtually all that's left of the Viking legacy in the East is the name Russia and Vladimir's seal on the Ukrainian flag. The Viking roots were scoured away by the cultural pull of the Eastern Roman Empire, a process completed in 1472 when the niece of the last Byzantine emperor married Ivan the Great. If the Rus became Slavic, however, they also changed the Slavs. They gave the Slavic world its first centralized state and its first lasting dynasty. They brought order to an unstable region and provided a foundation for the Slavic Empire that would come. Perhaps it was to be expected that the Viking influence would quickly wane, since the Scandinavians were always a tiny minority among a vast Slavic population. At least a part of the reason that it ended when it did, however, was because by Vladimir's time, the Viking world itself was changing. The days of footloose adventurers and prowling sea wolves were over. Scandinavia had become a land of kings. The Homelands. Chapter 19. Viking Kings. Our ravens croak to have their fill, the wolf howls from the distant hill. King Harold's Saga. The Viking Age is often judged by its impact on other cultures. It's remembered as a time of destruction, the brutal sacking of monasteries, the ruin of much of Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. But there was creation, too. Colonies were founded in Iceland and Greenland, a duchy was created in Normandy, great trading cities like Dublin and York flourished, and Russia gained its first centralized state. All of this, however, is focused outwards, and neglects the effect the Viking Age had on the Norse homelands. The most obvious impact can be seen from the mind-boggling amounts of loot, coins, silver, plate, and slaves. According to the various Frankish chronicles, in the 9th century alone, roughly 45,000 pounds of silver was handed over in payments to the Vikings, an amount representing perhaps a third of the total that was carried off. The 10th century was even more lucrative. In Anglo-Saxon England, King Athelred the Unready paid 180,000 pounds of silver in bribes. This was something on the order of 40 million English silver pennies, an amount that contributed greatly to the king's unpopularity. The flood of silver coming from England was increased by plunder from Ireland and the two Frankish kingdoms, as well as trade from markets ranging from Greenland to Byzantium. The availability of precious metals led to the development of a coin-based economy instead of a barter system, and further integrated Scandinavia into the wider European marketplace. In the great Viking trading towns like Hedeby and Birka, the Vikings even began to mint their own coins based on Frankish, Byzantine, or Anglo-Saxon models. Most of this wealth flooded into lands dominated by a warrior culture that prized individual prowess. Great figures built halls and gave generously to their followers. They were described as ring-givers and passed out bracelets, or tarks, for the arms and neck, weapons and armor, and ingots of gold, silver, or iron. Plunder was used as personal ornamentation, or buried in hoards to burnish reputations. The constant demand spurred the growth of luxury markets, which in turn drove the Vikings to exploit ever more extensive routes of trade. This exploration sparked a second, more profound change. During the 2.5 centuries of the Viking Age, the Norse probably had contact with a wider variety of cultures than any other single people on Earth. From Anglo-Saxon England and Imperial Byzantium in particular, they picked up models of a centralized form of government, which they brought back to Scandinavia. Returning sea kings found that their vast resources could be used not only for personal adornment, but to support armed companies of men. These slowly coalesced into royal armies which, supported by a Byzantine-style administration, further centralized power. As their wealth increased, so did their ability to do kingly things, like constructing stone buildings, raising walls, and decorating their palaces. By the close of the 10th century, this process was nearing completion. Strongmen were being transformed into petty kings who vied for control of the wealthy market towns of Scandinavia. The old Viking dream of the sea kings, dominance at sea, was vanishing, replaced by men who wanted to gain territory on land. Surprisingly, given the size of its coasts, the first to unify was Norway. Unlike the origin stories of most countries, Norway's founding myth is a love story. Around the year 860, Halfdan the Black, the petty king of an area in the southeast around modern Oslo, died, leaving his kingdom to his 10-year-old son, Harald Fairhair. According to the Heimskringla, an Icelandic account of the history of Norway, the boy fell in love with a nearby princess, but she refused to marry him until he was king over all of Norway. Harald took an oath not to cut or comb his hair until the job was done, and proceeded to slowly expand his territory. A more likely scenario is that the ambitious Harald was simply continuing a process that had been going on for several decades. His particular genius was to use fleets to do so. Each petty sea king that he conquered boosted the power of his own navy and made it harder to resist. The Climactic Battle occurred at Hafrsfjord, where the king crushed an alliance of petty kings and jarls and brought western Norway under his control. Although he probably only controlled the southern and western coasts, for the first time it is possible to talk about a kingdom of Norway. It was in Harald's best interest to suppress the old Viking traditions of sailing out for plunder in the summers, because this in turn created the very sea kings that he had struggled so long to overcome. Any raiding that took place would have to be either by his authority or permission, a fact that must have rankled many grizzled sea wolves. Many of them chose to leave Norway for freer lands in Iceland, the Orkneys, or the Faroes, forced out by Harald's uncompromising control. If he had really won Norway for a woman's love, it was the highest dowry Harald ever paid. Over the course of his 50 years, he allegedly collected 200 wives and had more sons than he knew what to do with. Even 3 generations later, nearly every jarl in Norway could credibly claim to be related to the first king. This tremendous fecundity, however, undid most of Harald Fairhair's hard work. He chose his favorite son, Eric Bloodaxe, to replace him, and even ruled jointly with him for a few years. This might have proved effective if there had been fewer claimants to the throne, or if his heir had behaved with more restraint. Eric, however, did his best to thin the family ranks. A good amount of the blood on his axe belonged to half-brothers, and lopped off the heads of countless jarls who resisted him as well. When a younger half-brother named Håkon the Good, who had been raised in England safely out of reach of Eric's hatchet, arrived with an English army at his back, Eric gave in without a fight. He was as tired of Norway as they were of him, and left for greener pastures in England. Håkon was the baby of the family, and had been born when his father was already an old man. He proved to be a far more competent administrator than his brother, and an innovative general to boot. When the sons of Eric Bloodaxe invaded, he crushed them at a hill which was later named the Blood Heights, due to all the carnage. When Eric's nephews tried again 2 years later, he positioned his army around 10 standards spread a massive distance apart along a ridge. This created the illusion that his force was much larger than it in fact was, and the unnerved invaders turned and ran. In addition to his martial abilities, Håkon is also responsible for attempting to introduce Christianity to Norway, a religion which would thoroughly change Scandinavia as it did other lands. The new faith, to which Håkon had probably converted in England, had much to recommend it. Not only did it provide a model of centralized power, as Vladimir had realized, God brooked no challengers to his authority in heaven, but it brought with it literacy as a free gift. A literate king, or at least one who employed literate men, could make his wishes known without face-to-face contact. The old system of personal charisma extended only as far as the king could physically go, but his writ could extend much farther. Literacy meant contracts, uniform laws, and official documents, the glue with which a kingdom was held together. Unfortunately for Håkon and subsequent Norwegian history, the population was firmly pagan, and the king's attempt to impose Christianity only managed to alienate most of his subjects. Perhaps over time he would have been successful, but in 961 the royal nephews invaded again, and although Haakon's army was victorious, he was mortally wounded in the struggle. Eric's oldest son, Harald Greycloak, was chosen as the new king, but he had little real authority. While Norway had been plagued by infighting, powerful kings had risen to the south and united the kingdom of Denmark. It was to these rulers that the sons of Eric Bloodaxe had appealed, and when they invaded Norway, it was at the head of a Danish army. Harald Greycloak had won his throne, but the price for Danish aid had been to accept the Danish king as an overlord. After less than a century of independence, Norway had slipped back into chaos. Chapter 20. Harald Bluetooth. Harald, who conquered for himself the whole of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Inscription on the Yelling Stone. Medieval Denmark was considerably larger than its modern incarnation. Extending across parts of Germany, Sweden, and Norway, it had the densest population and was by far the most powerful of the Scandinavian kingdoms. Much of its strength was due to a remarkable 10th-century family that ruled from their stronghold of Yelling on the eastern side of the Danish peninsula. The family patriarch was Gorm the Old, who started life as a typical Viking sea king, but managed to kill off or neutralize the surrounding petty rulers to unite most of the Jutland Peninsula under his control. He was a Viking of the old type, a raucous worshipper of Odin, Thor, and Frey, who claimed descent from Ragnar Lothbrok and spent each summer raiding. Gorm was generally suspicious of Christians, probably because of the powerful German kingdom directly to his south, and was said to go out of his way to be cruel to them. He had good reasons to be worried. Thanks to the missionary activity inspired by the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious a century before, there was a small Christian community in the Jutland Peninsula, and they would make a splendid pretext for the German king Henry the Fowler to intervene in Danish affairs. Whether Henry used that excuse or another one is unclear, but early in Gorm's reign, a German army was sent over the Danevirke, and Gorm was forced to recognize his southern neighbor as an overlord. This hardly checked the king's raiding activities, although he does seem to have generally avoided German lands. His companion in most of these raids was his oldest son, Canute, who was as vigorous a plunderer as he, and the two of them ransacked the coasts of northern France and the British Isles. Gorm's younger son, Harald Bluetooth, stayed with his mother, Thyra, a formidable woman who had led the Danish army against the invading Germans. She had a better reputation among Christians than her husband, and although pagan, may have exposed her son to at least a form of the new faith. The last years of Gorm's life were not happy ones. His wife died before he did, and the grieving king raised a great stone in her honor, with deeply carved runes that called her the Ornament of Denmark. His own end was clouded by treason. As he aged, Gorm began to fear for his favorite son's life. He vowed to kill anyone who threatened Canute's life, or even informed the king of his death. When word reached the court that Canute had actually been killed while attempting to take Dublin, there was an understandable reluctance to go tell the king. Finally, Thyra thought of an ingenious solution. While Gorm was away, she had the throne room hung in black for mourning. When the king returned, he realized immediately what had happened and cried out, "My son is dead." Since he had blurted it out himself, there were no executions, but death was still given its due. 2 days later, Gorm was dead of a broken heart. That at least is the legend, but there are some hints that foul play may have been involved. Canute had been shot in the back by an arrow while he was watching some games, hardly a likely death for a Viking. The two brothers had been together when it happened, and there were many who whispered that Canute's blood stained Harald's hands. 10th century Scandinavia was a violent place, however, and such unpleasantries could easily be forgiven if the new king provided effective leadership. The first thing that needed to be done was to take care of Gorm's corpse. Harald gave it a magnificent funeral, raising a huge mound of rough stones over his father's body. In the center was an ornate wooden chamber filled with the valuables of Denmark's first true king. He then raised a second runestone with an inscription informing posterity that he had made it to honor his parents. Having taken care of his predecessor's remains, Harald Bluetooth could now turn to the business of stamping his own authority over the kingdom. He did so in a way that thoroughly eclipsed his father. If Gorm the Old created the Kingdom of Denmark, it was his son, Harald Bluetooth, that created the Danish nation. He joined together the disparate tribes of the Jutland Peninsula into a single people, joining them temporarily with parts of southern Norway and Sweden. Harald Bluetooth needed a unifying idea to tie his people together, something larger than just a shared king or common laws. He found it in Christianity, and in 965 he officially converted. Much deliberation seems to have gone into his decision. The contemporary Saxon historian Widukind describes Bluetooth as a man who was eager to listen but late to speak. The chronicler goes on to describe the colorful argument that led to Harald Bluetooth's conversion. As expected, the abandonment of the old gods was hotly debated, culminating in a furious exchange between several members of the court and a German missionary named Poppo. The Danish nobility was willing to admit that Christ was a god, but held that he was not nearly as powerful as Thor or Odin. Poppo retorted that the latter two were in fact nothing but trolls, and that Christ was the only god. Throughout the exchange, Harald Bluetooth had remained quiet, but now, as swords were being drawn, he broke in, wondering aloud if Poppo was willing to back up his claims with a test. The cleric unhesitatingly agreed. A bar of iron was heated in a fire until it was glowing red, and the king commanded the monk to grab it with his bare hand. Poppo, declaring his faith in the power of his god, reached into the coals and seized it, holding it up before the assembled court until Harald begged him to put it down. He did so calmly, showing the various notables his undamaged hand. The impressed king converted on the spot. Another compelling reason for baptism was just south of Harald Bluetooth's borders. Henry the Fowler's son, Otto I, had traveled to Rome and been crowned emperor of a new Roman Empire. In addition to his German lands, he owned northern Italy, the Low Countries, parts of France, and much of Central Europe. He was still relatively young, and was well on the way to earning his epithet, the Great. Such a man would always be looking to expand his territory, and there was every reason to believe that Denmark would be the next course on the imperial plate. Bringing the gospel to the heathen Danes was precisely what a conscientious emperor should be doing. By accepting baptism, Harald Bluetooth deftly took away the major pretext for invasion. Christian monarchs did not go to war with each other, at least not with the blessing of the Pope, and Harald made sure that everyone knew that he and his dynasty were Christian. At his capital of Jelling, where the great pagan burial mounds were, he built a wooden church and exhumed his father's body. Gorm's bones were carefully wrapped in a rich cloth woven with threads of gold and transferred to the crypt of the new church. On the stone he raised to commemorate his father, he carved a figure of Christ emerging from the twisting thorns and the snake's coils of the pagan religion. The image encapsulates Harald Bluetooth's vision for his reign. This was to be a new era for Denmark, liberated from the clutter of the past, led by the faith of the future and a glorious new dynasty. Top-down conversions are never really quick. The old religion lingered on for decades, but Harald's adoption of Christianity marked a turning point for Denmark and all of Scandinavia. Unlike Håkon the Good in Norway, Harald Bluetooth's conversion stuck, and he succeeded in overcoming much of the pagan resistance. Perhaps he was able to do this because of his frequent demonstrations of raw power. The rest of his reign was spent churning out massive public works that overawed potential usurpers. The ancient Hyvene army road, which followed the watershed of the Jutland Peninsula and led down to the markets of Hamburg, was bisected by the Veja Fjord, roughly 6 miles south of Jelling. To allow his armies to cross, Harald Bluetooth built a great bridge over the river and marshy ground. Its scale was mind-boggling. Over half a mile long and more than 20 feet wide, it could support a weight of nearly 6 tons. More than 1,000 huge posts, for which whole oak forests had to be cut down to provide the timber, were driven into the ground to provide support. Just attempting such a structure was a statement of raw power. Even the densest woods would rot quickly in the marshy ground, and the entire thing would need to be rebuilt. This was not made to last the ages or be a permanent legacy. It was a message of strength for the here and now. No one else in Denmark, in the past or in Harold's time, could have made such a thing or done it so lightly. Harold Bluetooth's rise was noticed by the surrounding states. When Rollo's grandson, Duke Richard the Fearless, was temporarily driven from Normandy in the middle of the 10th century, he appealed to Harold for help. Harold not only helped him recover his territory, but repeated his aid 2 decades later when one of Richard's neighbors invaded Normandy. The most profitable request for aid, however, came from Norway. Years before, Bluetooth had married off his sister to Eric Bloodaxe, and when the latter had been overthrown, his son Harold Greycloak had come to Denmark to request aid. Bluetooth cannily gave his nephew some troops in exchange for an oath of loyalty. In 961, after the hard work of usurpation had been accomplished, he traveled to Norway and forced the reluctant Greycloak to recognize him as a superior. His nephew turned out to be a more effective king than Harold Bluetooth had realized or wanted. By seizing control of the eastern coastal trade routes, Greycloak extended his power into modern Finland and Russia, lessening his dependence on his uncle. Such a situation could obviously not be tolerated. So, in 970, Harold Bluetooth had his ambitious nephew assassinated and took control of western Norway, appointing a more pliant vassal to manage things while he was in Denmark. Harold Bluetooth's triumph in the north was the high watermark of his reign. There were rumblings of danger from the south, where the aging Otto the Great had noticed the growing threat. But he died in 973, and the threat passed. Unfortunately, it was Harold Bluetooth himself who undermined his own reign. For years he had carefully appeased his southern neighbor by sending tribute to Germany, but the combination of Otto's death and the victory in Norway seemed to have gone to his head. When ambassadors from the youthful Otto II arrived asking for the customary payment, he refused outright. Harold Bluetooth had badly misjudged his man. The German emperor had resources far beyond Harold's young kingdom, and a more disciplined and cohesive army. Although the first battles went well for the Vikings, the Imperial army pushed them back to the Dannevirke, and Bluetooth was forced to sue for peace. The loss should not have been particularly crushing, since Harold had kept the empire out of Denmark, but he had demonstrated the cardinal sin of the Viking world: weakness. The Norwegian king, a fervent supporter of Thor, who resented both Harold's religion and political control, rebelled, and Norway slipped out of Danish control. Everything seemed to crumble at once. Harold managed to keep his hold on Denmark, but just as he was preparing to push south against the Germans, his oldest son, Sven Forkbeard, who had been chafing under his father's authority, rebelled. Caught by surprise, the king fled to his stronghold at Jomsburg, on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. He could not have chosen a better sanctuary. The Joms Vikings were Scandinavia's most famous company of warriors. They were a fiercely loyal group between the ages of 18 and 50, handpicked for their bravery. They took strong oaths to live by a unique code of honor, and although staunchly pagan, would faithfully serve whoever paid them. Their fortress, situated on a harbor with easy access to the sea, was virtually impregnable. Harold Bluetooth was safe behind Jomsburg's walls, but he didn't get the chance to use it as a rallying point. In a skirmish outside the gates, he was wounded and died a few days later. The body was taken back to Jelling and interred in his church. He had written his own epitaph long before, when he had raised the great Jelling stone during his years of triumph. Like many things he did, the carving, ostensibly to show filial devotion, was in reality a canvas to proclaim his own greatness. This stone, he wrote, was raised by the herald who conquered for himself the whole of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Both claims are highly dubious. Norway was only partially held, and rather tenuously at that, and the old gods had hardly loosened their hold on Danish hearts. but it shows how Harold Bluetooth wanted to be remembered. Conquest and conversion, the two ways he built the nation of Denmark, were copied by his contemporaries in Sweden and Norway. As Harold Bluetooth lay dying, a Swedish minor king named Erik the Victorious was already consolidating the land around what is present-day Stockholm. He and his son and successor, Olaf Skotkonung, were accepted by the various sub-rulers as the first Swedish kings, and they duplicated the Danish model by converting to Christianity and using it to unite the main tribes. Ironically, the success of Harold Bluetooth and people like him was evidence that the Viking Age was beginning to wane. The days of untethered sea wolves roaming the waves were gone, and much of the old energy in Scandinavia was dissipating as well. The summers were just as likely to see royal tax collectors arriving as footloose young men slipping their longboats into the fjords. The three Viking kingdoms were joining the rest of Europe, slowly congealing into centralized monarchies. There were still wild parts. Norway in particular had not accepted either Christianity or the concept of autocratic kings, but the sun was nevertheless setting. Chapter 21. The Lure of English Silver. Whim rules the child, the weather, and the field. Edda of Saemund the Wise. Harold Bluetooth had been hurried to his grave by his son, and now that the old man was safely out of the way, Sven Forkbeard was crowned. The new king was ostensibly Christian like his father, but already had a reputation as a redoubtable warrior, largely acquired by his frequent summer raids into neighboring Christian kingdoms. There was more to this than continuing long-standing Viking traditions. The physical achievements of Harold Bluetooth, the fortifying of the Dannevirke, building fortresses and bridges, and handing out vast sums of money to his lieutenants, were made possible by the enormous amounts of silver that had been pouring into the Danish peninsula. By the 10th century, Vikings had become connoisseurs of the metal, being able to compare examples from the Islamic, Byzantine, and Western worlds. The highest quality, both in amount and purity, were Arabic dirhams. The millions of these coins flooding into the Jutland Peninsula enabled first Gorm and then Harold Bluetooth to establish themselves as gift-givers on a royal scale. In many ways, the Kingdom of Denmark was built on Arab silver. In the mid-10th century, however, the Arab supply began to dry up. Even worse, what little came from the eastern routes became seriously degraded in quality. When the Vikings first started trading with the Arabs, dirhams were roughly 90% silver. By the 11th century, that had plummeted to 5%. If Sven wanted to continue to act as his father and grandfather had, a new source of silver had to be found. Fortunately for the Danish king, there was a ready supply in a very familiar place. England's recovery from the ravages of the great heathen army had been nothing short of remarkable. Alfred the Great had been followed by a brilliant son and grandson who built up the kingdom and briefly forced even the Scots to acknowledge them as overlords. In the process, they transformed themselves from kings of Wessex to kings of England. Their success in creating a stable, prosperous state is illuminated by the nicknames the English gave them. Edmund the Just was followed by Eadwig the Fair, who was followed in turn by Edgar the Peaceful. England was among the most prosperous kingdoms of Western Europe, far surpassing the crumbling remains of the Carolingian Empire. 4 generations of rule by Alfred's family had given it a rare sense of security, and had overseen the golden age of Anglo-Saxon England. Unfortunately, this stability started to collapse, just as the Viking kingdoms were looking to exploit new revenue streams. The trouble started when Edgar the Peaceful died, leaving 2 young sons behind. The older of the pair, the 13-year-old Edward the Martyr, was crowned, but since he may have been illegitimate, he wasn't accepted by large parts of the north. After a short but turbulent reign, he was assassinated under cloudy circumstances, and his 10-year-old half-brother Athelred the Unready became king. There were suspicions from the start that Athelred's men were involved, although seemingly without his consent, and the slain king's body was unceremoniously dumped in a grave without royal honors. What is clear is that neither brother had control of government, but was surrounded, as all kings generally are, by grasping, ambitious courtiers acting in their name. Direction of the government began to founder, and power began to devolve to the nobility. Athelred the Unready has one of the more unfortunate nicknames in English history. The Anglo-Saxon word rad means counsel or advice, and so the king's name, Athelred, would translate as noble counsel. Unrad, or unready, therefore, would mean without counsel, probably referring to the low quality of advice the king got, not his state of preparation. It's also a pun on the king's name, noble counsel uncounseled. Ironically, this may have been because he was showing signs of actually becoming a strong king. In the first decade of his reign, he managed to break the power of the great magnates and centralize power in his own hands. The king wanted to keep his own counsel. Unfortunately for Athelred, however, just as he was getting to grips with the machinery of government, the Vikings returned. The second great wave of Viking attacks was, like the first, launched by Norwegians. In 991, a fleet of more than 90 ships arrived, led by the adventurer Olaf Tryggvason. The local forces proved hopelessly inadequate to stop them, and the Vikings plundered Essex at will. Finally, in August, an Anglo-Saxon army, under the command of a seasoned veteran named Byrhtnoth, stood up to them. The English commander gallantly, but rather foolishly, allowed the Vikings to cross from the island they were on to the mainland, but fell early in the fighting. Those who stayed and fought were slaughtered to a man. The rest fled in a panic. The disaster convinced Athelred that his army wasn't dependable, so he elected instead to buy the Norwegians off as a short-term solution. This led to a hemorrhaging of silver, which illustrates both the wealth of England and the ineffectiveness of the strategy. Athelred paid the Vikings 10,000 pounds of silver, but after collecting it, Olaf Tryggvason continued to raid, this time with the newly crowned Sven Forkbeard and his Danes along for the ride. The two plundered the south, taking all major towns except for London, where they were bloodily repulsed. Despite this little victory, Athelred again turned to the Danegeld, paying the two Vikings 16,000 more pounds of silver to leave. This time the king attached the usual condition of baptism. When it was awkwardly discovered that both were already baptized Christians, the ceremony was switched to confirmation, with Athelred standing in as a sponsor for Olaf. Both Vikings were satisfied, and each returned home to their respective countries soon after. In Olaf's case, this had less to do with the ceremony than it did with the thousands of pounds of silver that came with it. Olaf intended to make himself king of Norway, and now he had the resources to do it. Sven Forkbeard watched these developments with interest. Olaf Tryggvason was slightly older, and the two were close allies, but he probably watched his colleague's career with mounting tension. In 997, Olaf successfully seized the throne from Sven and set about founding a new capital at Trondheim. One of his first building projects was a church, Norway's first, which he used as a propaganda tool in his goal of forcibly converting the Norwegians to Christianity. The new king, known for his prodigious strength, must have been an imposing figure. Not only did he compel his reluctant jarls into the new faith, but he also imposed it on Norway's far-flung territories, with the result that the Faroes, the Orkneys, and Iceland had all accepted Christianity by 1000. Even Greenland was well on the way to do the same. That same year, a converted Leif Erikson left Olaf's court on his voyage of discovery. Although deeply resented by many of his subjects, it wasn't Olaf Tryggvason's religion that proved his undoing. A few years before, Sven Forkbeard had married off his sister to a Baltic chieftain. The union had proved unhappy, and against Sven's wishes, the woman had fled to Norway, where she was not only given shelter by Olaf Tryggvason, but taken as his wife. This ill-timed act convinced the Danish king that Olaf was his enemy. Forkbeard had been wary of his old colleague for some time. Much of Olaf's success at converting people was due to his massive flagship, the Long Serpent, which cruised up and down the fjords, imposing the king's authority. It was well known that Olaf wanted to expand his territory. He had already tried to marry the widowed Queen of Sweden, and there was a belief that he was now attempting to set himself up as king over all of Scandinavia by insinuating himself into the Danish royal family. The fears resulted in a Danish-Swedish alliance, and a combined fleet of 70 ships that managed to ambush Olaf as he sailed between Denmark and Norway. The Norwegian fleet of 11 ships was quickly overwhelmed, with only the Long Serpent successfully resisting. When it was clear to Olaf that even his great flagship was lost, he leapt overboard, clutching his weapons to speed his descent. The triumphal Sven Forkbeard divided Norway up with his allies, taking most of the south for himself. He was now the most powerful Scandinavian king, having restored most of his father's territorial holdings. It was at this moment, with Forkbeard at the height of his career, that Athelred the Unready made the worst mistake of his reign. While the Scandinavian kings had been occupied, Athelred had been trying vainly to stem the increasing Viking tide. Buying off Olaf and Sven had only demonstrated that extortion worked, and in the immediate years after, the English king had handed out another 108,000 pounds of silver in increasing installments. In his frustration, Athelred came to believe that his northern subjects in the Danelaw were either harboring or encouraging the raids. The paranoia made it easy to believe that there was a Danish plot on his life. So, on the 13th of November, 1002, he ordered the liquidation of every Dane in the kingdom. The slaughter, remembered as St. Brice's Day Massacre for the feast day on which it took place, was among the more foolish things Athelred ever did. The population of the Danelaw may have had some vestigial Scandinavian traditions, but they had repeatedly demonstrated loyalty to the English crown since the days of Athelred's grandfather. One of the thousands who died in the bloodbath was Sven Forkbeard's sister, Gunhild, who had settled in England with her Danish husband. Not only did Athelred alienate his own citizens, but he also earned the animosity of a Danish king at the peak of his powers. Sven wasted no time. The next year he was in England, harrying the West, but was driven off by a combination of unexpectedly stiff local resistance and a famine which made it difficult to live off the land. As he gathered additional troops, other independent Vikings kept up the pressure. The Jomsvikings, led by their leader Thorkel the Tall, conducted a profitable raid in Canterbury that netted 48,000 pounds of silver from Athelred's government. It should have been more, since they captured the Archbishop of Canterbury, the same man who had presided over the ceremony welcoming Olaf into the faith. But the stubborn cleric had refused to allow his parish to pay a penny for him, and the annoyed Vikings beat him to death. By 1013, Sven Forkbeard was ready, and he invaded England in force, not to punish Athelred, but to overthrow him. The hapless English king, who had seen his reign begin with such promise, was deserted by most of his subjects. The great-grandson of Alfred shamefully fled to Normandy, leaving England to the Vikings. London surrendered in December, and Sven Forkbeard was crowned on Christmas Day of 1013. Sven had accomplished what even the ferocious Ivar the Boneless had failed to do, but he didn't enjoy his new crown for long. Within a few weeks he fell ill, and by February he was dead. The body was washed, embalmed, and attended to by Sven's teenaged son, Canute, and then sent back to Denmark for burial. The great Viking dream of conquering England seemed over just as it had begun. Ironically, it was only now, with the Viking spirit half-tamed and the days of the sea-wolves vanishing, that the most successful and least appreciated of the Sea Kings arrived. Chapter 22. The Emperor of the North. Moribus inclutus facet hic, rex nomine Canutus. Here lies King Canute, illustrious for his conduct. The original epitaph of Canute. Sven Forkbeard may have had 2 crowns, but they weren't of equal importance to him. His beloved eldest son, Harold II, was crowned King of Denmark, while young Canute was given the unenviable task of governing the half-conquered England. The young man at least looked the part, The earliest description of him describes his exceptional height, prodigious strength, thick head of fair hair, and clear and penetrating eyes. The only flaw in this ruddy complexion was his nose, which was thin and rather hooked. Unfortunately for the new king, his subjects had soured on Danish rule. The citizens of the Danelaw confirmed his elevation, but the rest of the country didn't follow suit. They may have feared the father, but they saw no reason to pay homage to the son. As a mark of their determination to oust the invader, they sent a delegation to recall Athelred the Unready. The disgraced Anglo-Saxon king, who had spent 3.5 decades ruining his reputation, now saw it rehabilitated within a few months. He had been living in Normandy with his wife Emma and their 2 sons, at the court of his Norman brother-in-law, Duke Richard the Good. The English, however, didn't exactly welcome him with open arms. Before allowing his return, he was made to swear that he would not punish anyone who had supported Sven Forkbeard, and that he would enact certain reforms that his nobles suggested. Athelred agreed, and crossed the Channel leading an army composed of both Norman and English recruits. Canute had taken the sensible step of acquiring hostages from the leading nobles to ensure their loyalty, but his army was caught unprepared, and they defected anyway. Realizing that his position was hopeless, he fled to his fleet at Sandwich on the southern coast, pausing only long enough to mutilate his hostages and leave them bleeding on the beach for his disloyal former subjects to take care of. For Athelred, regaining his kingdom without a single battle must have been an exhilarating moment, a soothing balm for the long years of humiliation. Sadly, it didn't last. Within a year, his son, Edmund Ironside, revolted, establishing himself in the Danelaw and defying every attempt by his father to bring him under control. Even more serious was the fact that Canute hadn't given up. The exiled king sailed directly to his brother's court, where Harold II received him warmly, aiding in the recruitment of an army to reclaim England. This was probably motivated less by fraternal loyalty than a desire to see a potential competitor out of his kingdom, but either way it proved effective. Within 2 years, Canute had a fleet of 200 ships to carry his army of 10,000 Vikings. The invasion, so soon after Athelred's triumph, broke something in the aging and now sick king. He took no part in the defense of the kingdom, delegating those responsibilities to his son, Edmund Ironside, and his brother-in-law, Eadric the Grasper Striona. With Edmund, England was at least in capable hands. His vigorous defense of London won him the admiration of his father's subjects, and when Athelred finally expired a few months later, Edmund was unanimously elected as king of what was left of the kingdom. Athelred had lived long enough for one final humiliation. His brother-in-law, Eadric Striona, had issued a vote of no confidence by publicly deserting to Canute, winning lasting infamy as the most notorious traitor in English history. The combined Danish and English army pursued Edmund into Wessex, where 2 inconclusive battles were fought. Canute withdrew into Mercia, and Edmund Ironside surprisingly went after him, forcing him to retreat further. The small victory convinced the waffling Eadric Striona to rejoin the English side, where he was welcomed largely for the men he brought with him. Edmund needed to raise additional fresh troops, so he set off through Essex. As he was marching through open country, however, Canute managed to surprise him. The battle was hard-fought and bloody, and at the climactic moment Eadric Striona once again deserted his countrymen and handed the victory to the Danes. Edmund Ironside was wounded in the fighting, and most of his nobles were killed. He fled, with what was left of his army, to an island in Gloucestershire, and there came to an agreement with Canute. England north of the Thames would be Danish, while he would retain the south. Furthermore, the lands of the king who died first would be given to the survivor, whose children would be heirs to the entire kingdom. The treaty amounted to an unconditional surrender. Both sides could see that the stricken Edmund Ironside wouldn't live much longer, while Canute was in the bloom of life. It was little more than a tactful agreement, perhaps as a nod to Edmund's heroic defense of his kingdom, to spare the English sovereign the humiliation of exile. In any case, Canute didn't have long to wait to claim his prize. Edmund only clung to life for a few weeks before succumbing to his wounds. On January 6, 1017, Canute was crowned, becoming the first Viking king of England. Little more than a century after Alfred had defeated the Vikings, his descendants had ceded it all to the Danes. If history had taught Canute anything, it was that English crowns did not sit easily on Viking heads. He had already lived through one coronation that had failed because the English preferred even the most unpopular native monarch to a foreign one. Under no illusion that anything had changed, he set about firming up his control. Potential threats were ruthlessly crushed. Edmund Ironside's younger brother was executed, as were many native earls who had supported the late English king. Displaying a good sense that had escaped his two predecessors, Canute also had Eadric Striona killed, exposing his head on London Bridge. Not all those who had remained loyal to Edmund were punished, however. One noble in particular, a half-Danish man named Godwin, had been unwaveringly faithful to the English king, and was therefore greeted with skepticism when he then pledged himself to Canute. The king asked him why he should trust a man who had until recently been his implacable enemy, and Godwin responded with the argument that his constancy was proof against suspicion. The king, he continued, should instead be wary of those who switched sides during the war. He, on the other hand, had proved his loyalty even when his side was obviously doomed. Could Canute's English allies claim the same thing? Charmed, Canute made Godwin the first Earl of Wessex, and even allowed him to marry his sister-in-law. The formerly obscure noble became the most powerful native earl in England. To strengthen his legitimacy, Canute married into the native royal family. Athelred the Unready's Norman widow Emma was both eligible and relatively young, and more than happy to abandon her two sons to regain royal power. The fact that Canute was already married to an Englishwoman, Elfgefu of Northampton, was tactfully overlooked. Elfgefu faded quietly to the background, and Emma took up residence with Canute. The new marriage proved successful, and in a short time Emma presented her husband with a boy that they named Harthacnut. Since Canute already had two sons, Sven and Harold Harefoot, by his first wife, the succession was now secure. Canute had crushed all opposition to his rule, so he disbanded his army, keeping only 40 ships and their crews as a standing army. To pay off his veterans, he needed to raise the enormous sum of 72,000 pounds of silver, roughly half of what Athelred the Unready paid out during his entire reign. It was a measure of Canute's control and England's financial stability that he was able to do it. Ironically, he used the system that his predecessor had put in place to bribe the Vikings. The usual officials were sent out, and a final Danegeld payment was collected from the English to pay off the army that had conquered them. No sooner had Canute released his forces, however, than his elder brother, Harold II, King of Denmark, died. Canute only had his small English army available, but he picked up some Viking recruits and sailed for Denmark to press his claims for the crown. There was considerable irony in this latest campaign. After more than 2 centuries of abuse, the tables had finally turned. Now an English army was setting out to conquer Denmark. Accompanied by Earl Godwin and other English nobles, Canute plundered his way to the Danish capital of Jelling, sweeping all resistance aside. The campaign inaugurated a remarkable decade of conquests, unparalleled in Viking history. Within a year, he had been accepted as King of Denmark and was recognized as the dominant figure of Scandinavia. The Swedes and Norwegians resisted his growing power, but they were both entering periods of weakness. At the Battle of the Helgeau in 1026, Canute's longships defeated the combined navies of his enemies, and he was recognized as King of Norway and parts of Sweden. Canute returned to England, where he received the submission of 3 Scottish kings, including Shakespeare's Macbeth, and possibly a representative of Viking Dublin. The Irish Battle of Clontarf had been fought in 1014, the year Canute had prepared his invasion of England. The shattering of Irish Viking power had left a vacuum that allowed Canute to dominate the western colonies and their important trading contacts. Canute had ascended to heights beyond even the wildest imaginations of those first raiders who had poured out of Scandinavia in the 8th century. He ruled a vast northern empire stretching from the Baltic to the Irish Seas, from Scandinavia to the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and the Isle of Man. He had become the greatest of the sea kings, ruler of the only North Sea empire in history. Canute intended to be more than a simple conqueror, however. His vision was to unite his disparate holdings into a single state. English-style coins were minted in Scandinavia, so that merchants hawking their wares in Copenhagen or London were paid with similar coins. He also brought his system of weights and measures into line with those used in Constantinople, hoping to integrate his lands into the broader European marketplace. By 1027, Canute's status as one of the premier monarchs of Europe was confirmed when the Pope personally invited him to watch the coronation of the new Roman Emperor Conrad II. Although Canute traveled leisurely to Rome as a pilgrim, the trip was a public relations triumph. The emperor was a similar age, and the two hit it off immediately. They walked side by side in the processions and were seated next to each other in public. The German territory of Schleswig, the land bridge between the German Empire and Denmark, had been a source of conflict between the two kingdoms for generations. As a measure of his affection for his newfound brother monarch, Conrad donated it to Canute, and the Dane pledged his daughter Gunhild to Conrad's son. The coronation itself left a lasting imprint on Canute. As soon as he returned to England, he commissioned a replica of the imperial crown and assiduously cultivated the image, if not the title, of imperial rule. He ruled England for nearly 2 decades, on the whole wisely and well. When he died in 1035, he was genuinely mourned. The body was taken to Winchester and interred in a crypt in the cathedral. He should be remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs, but instead he remains curiously distant. One reason is surely that most of what he built collapsed shortly after his death. Within a decade, all of his children were dead, and his empire had crumbled to dust. England returned once more to its native dynasty, and a Norwegian king conquered Denmark. Canute was a man caught between two worlds. He was too Christian to be immortalized by the pagan skalds, and too pagan to serve as a Christian hero. In many ways, the greatest of the Viking sea kings wasn't really a Viking at all. He took great pains to cast himself as a just and orderly ruler, made 2 pilgrimages to Rome, and used his influence to exempt his subjects from Roman tolls. In stark contrast to his ancestors, who had targeted churches and earned the nickname sea wolves for their predatory activities, Canute endowed numerous religious houses and donated countless precious chalices, crosses, and illuminated manuscripts to churches across his extensive lands. The most famous vignette from his life is not prowess in battle or generosity with spoils. It is of him sitting in a chair and commanding the waves to retreat. Far from a delusion of grandeur, this was his lesson to his flattering courtiers, that even the power of the greatest of kings was ultimately empty. Only the divine should be worshipped. But despite all of the king's pious activities, the offerings, tax exemptions, and church building, he could never quite shake the Viking reputation for paganism. When he donated some gifts to a French cathedral, its bishop expressed surprise, writing that he had heard Canute was a heathen prince. The bloody battles and cloudy marital situation contributed to the unease, and there were few glowing accounts written of his life. As much as he was appreciated by his English subjects, he was never fully accepted as one of them. Canute's ambiguous place in English history was mirrored by the Vikings themselves, whose world was rapidly changing. The restless days of adventuring young men, plundering monasteries, exploring the oceans, and returning as sea kings were over. Although Christ had not yet completely vanquished Odin, the pirates had largely turned to merchants, and the skalds to priests. The Viking skill at shipbuilding had been turned to the construction of magnificent wooden churches, and missionaries were active throughout the north. Almost as profound was the political change. Once the Vikings prided themselves on their independence. Now the same people who had proudly informed a French ambassador that they recognized no king faithfully paid taxes to a monarch and served in his army. As the kings consolidated their power, the old spirit of exploration began to wane. Finland was abandoned, contact with Greenland lapsed, and Scandinavia began to lose its dominance at sea. Only in the half-tamed west of Norway did a flicker of the old Viking spirit remain. Chapter 23. The End of an Age. Mighty Harold is fallen, and we are all imperiled. King Harold's Saga. No family better symbolized the changing world than the pair of half-brothers Olaf the Stout and Harald Hardrada. They were the sons of a remarkable woman named Asta Gudbrandsdottir, who married in quick succession 2 petty kings in the southeast of Norway. Olaf was a product of the more distinguished marriage, and could claim descent on his father's side from Harald Fairhair, the first Norwegian king. Harald Hardrada, on the other hand, was the youngest son of Asta's second marriage to a mild nonentity named Sigurd the Sow. Harald was rebellious and ambitious, qualities he inherited from his mother, but looked up to his older brother. At age 13, Olaf left home to go raiding in the Baltic, proving himself to be a gifted soldier. In 1014 he led an attack on London, helping to destabilize Canute's early reign and force his precipitous flight. The young Viking crossed the Channel and wintered at the court of Duke Richard the Good of Normandy, where he accepted Christianity and was baptized at Rouen, with the Duke serving as his godfather. The newly Christian Olaf returned home with a vision of uniting Norway under the new faith, much as his ancestor Harald Fairhair had done politically. At first all went well. Olaf crushed a collection of his enemies, and within a year had established himself over a larger area than any previous Norwegian king. He brought the Orkneys firmly under his control, drove the Danish nobles out of Norway, and married one of the Swedish king's illegitimate daughters. At the same time, he established a competent administrative network that made it possible to govern the entire country. King Olaf, however, was not especially popular. Although a highly intelligent man who was an accomplished poet and a gifted strategist, he was fiercely protective of his authority and at times bordered on arrogant. His relationship with his nobles, who were unused to a king that actually ruled, was never good, and his attempts to Christianize his peasants led to a smoldering discontent. On one occasion, he cut out the tongue of a man who refused to convert, and on another blinded a noble who proved intractable. There was a vague suspicion that it was more than piety that drove him. As the saga of Olaf Haraldsson put it, Olaf was of little speech, but greedy of money. All that was needed was a spark to turn dissent into rebellion. It was provided by Canute, who had been annoyed by Olaf's success at reducing Danish influence in Norway. In 1028, the English king's money fanned the growing hostility into an insurrection that toppled Olaf from his throne. The exiled king fled to the court of his brother-in-law, the Grand Duke of Kiev, Yaroslav the Wise. He spent a year gathering mercenaries, and in 1030 he attempted to regain his throne. Leading a motley group of Danish, Swedish, and some Norwegian Vikings, he crossed into Sweden, where he was met by his 15-year-old half-brother, Harald Hardrada, with 600 more men. If Olaf expected to be welcomed back by his former subjects, or at least to overawe them with his military strength, he was disappointed. On July 29th, a collection of Norwegian farmers and nobles met his army as he attempted to enter the country near a northern farm called Stiklestad, and barred his way. The most famous battle in Norwegian history was fought, at least according to Snorri's red-blooded account, in the darkness of a solar eclipse. The king's army gave a good account of itself, but was probably heavily outnumbered. Olaf, leading from the center of his line, where the fighting was heaviest, was wounded in the knee, and as he stumbled back, suffered a ghastly wound in the neck. He slumped over a stone and was felled by a third and fatal blow to the stomach. With the king's death, his army disintegrated, scrambling to escape the carnage. The victorious nobles pursued, halting only when the setting sun made killing difficult. Olaf's body was quietly buried in the bank of a nearby river, and those members of his army that escaped discreetly returned to other occupations. The defeated Olaf's influence, however, had only just begun with his death. As the country languished under foreign domination, the Norwegians began to rehabilitate their native king. Within a year, his body was exhumed and found to be miraculously preserved. His death, fought auspiciously under darkness similar to that of Calvary, served as proof of his sanctity, and that year he was canonized with the blessing of the Pope. A magnificent cathedral was built over the site of his burial, with its high altar enclosing the stone he had died against. In death, Olaf was much more potent than he had been in life. He became the champion of the poor and oppressed, the great defender of merchants and sailors, a lion of the faith. The inconvenient details, that the army he commanded at Stiklestad was made up largely of foreign pagans, that the Norwegians themselves had killed him, and that he was at times a divisive, grasping ruler, slightly addicted to concubines, were quietly dropped. The rejected monarch became Rex Perpetuus Norwegii, the eternal king of Norway, patron saint and national icon. Olaf's half-brother, Harald Hardrada, cuts an altogether different figure. A giant of a man, supposedly 7.5 feet tall, he had a personality that was as large as his frame. From his mother he had absorbed a precocious ambition as well as a cunning mind, both traits that were already on display at the Battle of Stiklestad. The 15-year-old Harald had fought bravely, but had been seriously wounded, surviving only by hiding under some corpses under a ditch until darkness made escape possible. He fled to a remote part of eastern Norway, where he managed to hide in a farm until his wounds had healed enough to travel. Rumors of his survival had undoubtedly begun to be whispered, so as soon as he was able, he headed east to the welcoming court of Yaroslav the Wise. It was a dangerous journey, and the chances of restoring his position in Norway were slim, but Harald's confidence characteristically didn't slip. As he traveled, the teenager composed a poem, glorifying both his past and future. My wounds were bleeding as I rode. From wood to wood I crept along, and down below the nobles strode, killing the wounded with the sword. Who knows, I thought, a day may come when they follow their rightful lord. My name will yet be great at home. Harald spent several years in Kiev, providing valuable service to the Grand Prince Yaroslav, who was in need of an experienced commander, as well as the 500 Vikings Harald had brought with him, and the Norwegian became a respected captain, leading several assaults on the neighboring Poles and various steppe nomads. Wanting to elevate his position further, Harald asked Yaroslav's permission to marry his daughter, but was coldly rebuffed. He may have scored some victories against Kiev's enemies, but he had hardly won enough renown to court the Grand Prince's daughter. If Harald wanted a reputation to match his ambitions, there was only one place large enough to win it. So after 3 years among the Russ, Harald and his men braved the rapids of the Dnieper and headed for Constantinople. The Vikings called it the Great City, and in 1034, when Harald arrived, it fully justified its lofty reputation. The city had just witnessed the coronation of a new emperor, Michael IV, with all of the attending pomp and public ceremonies. The rumor in every corner of the city was that a fresh military campaign was being planned, and the addition of 500 Viking warriors to the celebrated Varangian Guard was an unexpected boost. If the two men ever saw each other face to face, Harald would not likely have been impressed by the emperor. Michael IV was the son of a peasant from the southern coast of the Black Sea, and before being crowned had made a tidy career as a money changer and, some said, as a particularly talented forger. He owed his elevation completely to his looks and his older brother, a powerful eunuch, who had introduced him to the recently widowed Empress Zoe. She had fallen madly in love with Michael, and despite being more than 3 decades older, had married and raised him to the throne. As thanks, Michael had immediately confined her to the women's quarters of the palace, completely excluding her from any share in power. He may have been an ungrateful boor, but Michael proved to be a competent administrator who guided the empire to a minor economic boom. Unfortunately, he also suffered from epilepsy, and his incapacitating fits made it impossible for him to lead his armies in battle. This was a serious concern because the empire was hard-pressed on every side. In the Balkans, the Serbs broke free from imperial control and northern Greece was raided, and in Asia Minor, marauding Arabs sacked several important cities. Michael desperately needed competent military men to staunch the bleeding. So the arrival of Herald must have seemed like a godsend. Harold's days in Constantinople would prove among the most fruitful of his life. He had found an employer with both the need for his services and seemingly unlimited funds. There was the small matter of his noble status, since the Byzantines were reluctant to allow Scandinavian royalty to join the Guard, but it was fairly easy to conceal, and in any case, Michael was hardly in a position to be picky. Fittingly, for the man who is considered the last of the Vikings, Harold first saw action at sea. The Byzantine Navy was tasked with clearing the eastern Mediterranean of Arab pirates, and Harold led many of the assaults from his longship. He was then sent into Asia Minor to push the Arabs out of Byzantine territory. In these campaigns, Harold's bravery won him the loyalty of most of the Varangian Guard, and he was soon appointed as its commander. His standard, a raven banner that he had named Land Waster, fluttered at the center of the imperial line, a rallying point where the fighting was thickest. Imperial service took Harold to the far ends of the medieval world. The Land Waster flew in every corner of the empire, and in some cases a good deal beyond. In 5 short years, he fought from Syria to the Caucasus, crushed a Bulgarian uprising, raided in North Africa and the Cyclades, and even took part in a delegation to Jerusalem, where he bathed in the Jordan River. In one remarkable series of raids, he supposedly captured 80 Arab strongholds, only stopping when he reached the Euphrates. Triumphs like these were noticed by the emperor, who rewarded the commander of his guard by raising him to a noble rank and minting a coin in his honor. That same year, Michael IV launched his most ambitious campaign, an invasion of Sicily, which would hopefully oust the Arabs and return the island to imperial control. The Byzantine general appointed to oversee the operation, a giant of a man named George Maniakes, was taking no chances. In addition to the Varangian guards, he collected a huge army of mercenaries, including a contingent of Normans led by William Ironarm. Even among the large army, Harold Hardrada soon distinguished himself. Maniakes used the Varangians as the tip of the spear, sending them crashing into the center of the enemy lines. He also sent them on repeated raids, hoping to break the will of the Sicilian Arabs. This allowed Harold to personally capture several cities, both by force and trickery. On one occasion, after surrounding a particularly well-defended town, he realized that his soldiers were unlikely to be able to storm their way inside. He had noticed, however, that several species of birds were using the thatched roofs to construct their nests. Each morning, they would fly out into the surrounding countryside to forage and return in the evening. He decided to copy Olga's trick and instructed his men to capture as many of them as they could, treating the townspeople to the unusual and presumably amusing sight of hundreds of Vikings scurrying around trying to trap birds. Their laughter, however, was soon muted by horror. Harold attached shavings of wood smeared with wax to the backs of the birds and lit them on fire. When the panicked animals were released, they flew straight to their nests, starting a blaze in nearly every building in the town. Although he covered himself in glory, the Sicilian campaign was not a success. After alienating his Norman mercenaries in a petty argument about a campsite, the volatile Maniakes struck one of his inept commanders, a man who happened to be the emperor's brother-in-law, in the face. Maniakes was recalled in disgrace, and the entire campaign collapsed. Harold Hardrada escaped any blame for the fiasco, but his career abruptly stalled as well. Michael IV's epilepsy was growing worse, and by the time Harold returned from Sicily, it was apparent to everyone that the emperor was dying. Swollen from dropsy, he exhausted himself searching for both divine and secular cures until December of 1041, when he finally expired. He had characteristically refused his wife's repeated requests to see him, forcing her to remain in her gilded prison, and bullied her into adopting his nephew Michael V as her heir. The new emperor proved a more reluctant patron for Harold, whose own appetites had begun to get him into trouble. He was arrested at least twice, although both accounts of his punishments are somewhat fanciful. The first time, on the emperor's command, he was exposed to a lion for debauching a woman of quality. As befitted a Viking hero, Harold responded by strangling the beast, and was released by his astonished guards. The second arrest was more serious. He was accused of keeping a larger share of booty than he was entitled to, a serious and quite believable charge. Fortunately for Harold, the weak Michael V only lasted 4 months before being overthrown in a bloody coup. In the confusion, Harold managed to escape his prison and join in the fighting, supposedly personally blinding the emperor as revenge for his incarceration. By this time, Harold Hardrada had had enough of Byzantium, and, with burnished reputation in tow, he returned to Kiev to claim his bride. Waiting for him was a decade worth of accumulated loot that he had been sending back to Yaroslav for safekeeping. The fact that the Grand Prince handed over his daughter without further protest was a dramatic confirmation of Harold's elevated status. Yaroslav's other daughters were married to the kings of France and Hungary, and his son was married to the Byzantine emperor's daughter. Part of this newfound acceptance was wealth. His time in the East had netted Harold so much plunder that when he loaded it into his longship, Dragon, it nearly sank. According to the Vikings themselves, his riches were almost as legendary as his martial skills. Nobody, they claimed, had ever seen anything like it in the possession of a single man. But the marriage was also recognition of his abilities as a commander and a reputation that had spread throughout the north. He was now an equal to the most elevated monarchs of his day. All he needed was a crown. To correct that final omission, Harold sailed with his new wife to Norway, where his nephew Magnus had been crowned king. In typical fashion, he reintroduced himself to his kinsman by demanding half of the king's treasury and land. When Magnus refused, Harold cheerfully unfurled the land waster and set about imposing his authority. The desperate Magnus tried everything he could think of to stop his uncle, including sending assassins to kill him in his sleep. Harold dodged this by keeping a log in his bed while he slept on the floor, easily dispatching the confused assassins who hacked uselessly at the blankets. The Civil War was mercifully ended after only 2 years when Magnus abruptly died without an heir, charitably naming Harold as his successor. It was this 19-year reign that won Harold the name Hardrada, or Hard Ruler, by which he is known to posterity. He had gained more than wealth during his time in the south. Byzantium had shown him what pure autocratic rule looked like, and he intended to copy it in the north. His half-brother Olaf had lost the throne to rebellious nobles, but Hardrada would show them no mercy. Quite a few of the stubborn jarls were forced to kiss the thin-lipped axe, as the dreaded land waster lived up to its name. Those who defied him, or moved too slowly obeying him, had their lands harried and destroyed. The important trading center of Hedeby was sacked, and frightened merchants began calling him the Thunderbolt of the North. Hardrada may have been a pitiless king, but there was more to his reign than destruction. Byzantium had given him a taste for autocracy, but it had also made him appreciate the influence of royal patronage and of grand gestures. When Iceland suffered a terrible famine, Harold sent several ships loaded with food for its relief, securing both a short-term surge in popularity and the lasting admiration of the Skalds. Charity, however, was not to be confused with softness. The same year he aided Iceland, a revolt in the uplands of Norway was brutally suppressed, and in 1050, as a symbol of his power, he built a new city at the head of the Oslo fjord to intimidate the south. Most of Harold's private activity, however, was, ironically, the construction of churches. Although his own grasp of Christianity might have been tenuous, his wife was thoroughly orthodox, and she brought priests and missionaries with her. Harold supported these efforts, and the man who had made much of his money looting religious houses became a patron of the church. The one thing that Harold never outgrew was his love for adventure. Usually this was in the form of battle, but occasionally he combined it with trips of exploration. Over the course of 2 decades, he brought the Orkneys, Hebrides, and the Shetlands under his control and attempted at least one expedition to the far west. Years after his death, Icelandic skalds sang how he had explored the expanse of the Northern Ocean and seen at length the darksome bounds of a failing world. When exactly Harald Hardrada found the time for a northern cruise isn't clear, since there was hardly a year where he wasn't fighting. After overcoming his nephew Magnus, he tried to add Denmark to his kingdom, spending the better part of 15 years warring with its king, Sven Estridsson. By 1064, even Harald Hardrada was tired of the struggle. Sven had turned out to be a remarkably slippery opponent and had worn down the Norwegians by refusing to commit to a pitched battle. The yearly raids had neither eroded Danish support for their king nor been particularly rewarding for Hardrada's men. Since the Norwegian king was bored and Sven wasn't going to spontaneously quit, the two reached a peace settlement where they agreed to recognize the other's dominions and to refrain from attacking each other. Perhaps one reason why Harold was willing to make peace was that his attention was already shifting across the North Sea to England, where King Edward the Confessor was clearly dying. The Anglo-Saxon monarch had no heir, and Harald Hardrada had what he considered to be a reasonable claim to the throne. There was no greater prize to an old Viking than England, and this seemed a tantalizing opportunity. Official justification for an invasion was usually not even an afterthought for the Vikings, but in this case Harald Hardrada actually had one, a possibility that must have acutely whetted his appetite. In Norwegian eyes, Edward should never have been king in the first place. 2 decades earlier, Canut's childless son, Harthacnut, had named Magnus of Norway as his successor, stipulating that Magnus and his heirs would inherit the English crown. Before Magnus could claim his prize, however, Edward, with the help of the powerful Earl, Godwin, had seized the throne instead. Magnus had never been in a position to correct this oversight, but this hardly invalidated the claim. Since Hardrada had in turn succeeded Magnus, he was therefore owed the throne of England as well. Of course, the English had no intention of handing over the country to the Vikings, especially not to one with Hardrada's reputation. So when Edward died on the 5th of January, 1066, they crowned Earl Godwin's son, Harold, king instead. The news was probably brought to Hardrada by the new king's brother, Tostig, who had been exiled from England and was trying to recruit an army to return and overthrow his sibling. In the spring of 1066, Tostig visited the Norwegian court and convinced Harald Hardrada to press his claim, most likely with exaggerated promises of native support. After raising a massive fleet of 240 ships containing around 9,000 men, the Vikings crossed the North Sea and raided Scotland before putting back to sea and continuing down the Northumbrian coast. They landed on English soil, 9 miles from the city of York, and were met by a hastily mustered Anglo-Saxon army commanded by 2 teenaged earls. The battle was a short and bloody one, and although both earls survived, the English army was routed. Hardrada entered York unopposed, carrying the land waster ahead of him. Probably on Tostig's advice, the Vikings didn't loot the city. Before his exile, Tostig had been the Earl of Northumbria, and he wanted to be restored to an intact earldom. So Hardrada only asked to meet with the chief representatives of the city to discuss terms. After a short conference, the city fathers agreed to hand over hostages, asking for a few days to gather the requisite tribute. They agreed to deliver both to the nearby site of Stamford Bridge, a convenient crossing of the Derwent River. Satisfied, Hardrada returned to his ships to collect supplies and rest. When the assigned day to collect the captives arrived, Harold decided to split his forces, leaving part of them to guard the ships, while the rest marched the several miles to Stamford Bridge. Since it was a hot day, most of his men left their mail shirts and the bulk of their weapons behind on board the longships. When the Viking army reached Stamford Bridge, they caught sight of a cloud of dust rising from the direction of York. Tostig somewhat naively assured Hardrada that it was the people of his former earldom come to surrender. But as they got closer, the Norwegians could see the sun glinting off of metal. The deluded Earl weakly proposed that they were bearing tribute, but instead it proved to be an Anglo-Saxon army led by the English king. Harold Godwinson's march from London to Stamford Bridge remains one of the most impressive military feats of the early medieval period. The king had been in London when word of the invasion had reached him, and he had immediately bolted north, covering the nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. He had then taken the precaution of posting guards on the main roads to stop any news of his arrival from reaching the Vikings. When he suddenly appeared, therefore, he took them completely by surprise. Hardrada was now in a nightmarish position. Cut off from his ships and only half-armed, his men were scattered and disorganized. Fortunately, as he hurriedly rallied his men around the land waster, a group of Englishmen rode forward and asked for a parley. At its head was Harold Godwinson, the diminutive, by Hardrada's standard, king of the English. He begged his brother Tostig to withdraw, offering up to half the kingdom if he would leave in peace. When Tostig asked what the king would give Hardrada, he is said to have responded, 6 feet of English soil, or, since he's a tall man, a little more. This was, as it turned out, the culminating battle in more than 2.5 centuries of English and Viking battles, and fittingly, no quarter was asked or given. Hardrada sent 3 runners to fetch the men guarding the ships, a round trip of more than 16 miles, and went roaring into the attack, swinging a massive battle-axe with each hand. Even only half-armed, the Vikings at first seemed indestructible. The English came crashing into their shields, but were thrown back with terrible slaughter. In the momentary pause, Hardrada led a tactical retreat across the bridge, reforming his shield wall on the other side. For a brief moment, it looked as if Viking courage would trump Anglo-Saxon numbers. Harold Hardrada rushed forward, a lone wolf turning on the pursuing hounds. But as he raised his twin axes, an English arrow struck him in the throat, stopping him in his tracks. As the thunderbolt of the north fell, the English tide swallowed the land waster, breaking what remained of the Viking army. The carnage was terrible. A lucky few managed to reach the ships, but most fell at Stamford Bridge, or were drowned while trying to swim to safety. Only 1/10 of the ships that had landed a week before were needed to take the survivors back to Norway. It was, in a way, a fitting end to the Viking Age. After 3 pitiless centuries of the Norse winter, Ragnarok had come, leaving the old gods dead on a blood-soaked field. The Valkyries had summoned their heroes. Surely Harold Hardrada, despite his nominal Christianity, would have fit right in, and the former order had been swept away. There was no better representative of the vanishing epoch than the grizzled king. Harold Hardrada had traveled the length and breadth of the Viking world, from the wide Dnieper, where it passed by Kiev, to the mighty rapids that led to gleaming Constantinople. He had seen the legendary throne room of the emperors, dripping in gold and bristling with hidden passageways. He had walked in the orange groves of Sicily, washed in the marble fountains of Palestine, and seen the frog-shrouded islands of the North Atlantic. He had known the Viking world as few others had, in all the waning splendor of its twilight. He had worn the nicknames of Hard Ruler, Jerusalem-farer, Troop Leader, and Poet, accolades any Viking would have been proud to bear. And when he was buried in his capital of Trondheim, the sun finally set on the Viking Age. Epilogue. The Viking Legacy. No man lives till eve, whom the fates doom at dawning. Edda of Saemund the Wise. The world the Vikings left behind was fundamentally changed from the one that they had come crashing into nearly 3 centuries before. The part they are usually given in this transformation is one of destruction. Even now, almost a millennium after Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge, the enduring image of them is of wild barbarians leaping from their dragon ships, axes hungry for gore. But although they were violent, and they waged war with a ferocity that their victims couldn't equal, the destruction they brought was ultimately creative. As one historian put it, the burning of the tares makes for richer soil at the next planting. They altered the political and economic landscape wherever they went, and played a critical role in building the foundations of Western Europe from Ireland to Russia. It was the Vikings who exposed the sprawling empire of Charlemagne, revealing fundamental flaws in the organization of that would-be Roman Empire. As it broke apart under the hammer blows of the Vikings, the survivors were forced to create smaller, more efficient states. Out of the ashes of the Viking assault rose the four great medieval powers of Western Europe: France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sicily. All four of these were direct products of the Viking Age, and three of them were founded or consolidated by Viking descendants. Before the Norse arrived, England was politically divided and loosely organized. By wiping out all but one native kingdom, the Vikings ensured that it would be unified by the House of Wessex into a single nation. Scotland, too, benefited in the long run from Viking depredations. The native Picts, Strathclyde Britons, and Northumbrians who dominated it were all destroyed, leaving the unlikely Scots, Gaelic-speaking Irish immigrants, to unify the northern third of Britain. In France, the Vikings founded a state, the Duchy of Normandy, that would redraw the map of Europe. Just 2 days after Harold Hardrada fell, William the Conqueror, great-great-great-grandson of the Viking Rollo, landed on English soil. He defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings and was crowned King of England, integrating the island into the broader orbit of Western Europe. His successors invaded Ireland, whose brilliant monastic culture had been shattered by the Viking attacks, and added Scotland and the surrounding islands to the Western European political orbit. Other Normans headed south and west, campaigning in Spain and northern Italy. They crossed to Sicily and founded the West's wealthiest medieval kingdom there, a rival to mighty Constantinople. At the same time, Viking traders in the east were establishing the market towns and trade routes with Byzantium that would bring Roman institutions far beyond the borders of the ancient Roman Empire. The centralized states that they founded would eventually develop into what is today the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. There was more than brute force to these sea wolves. They were makers of law. The term itself comes from an Old Norse word, and they introduced a novel form of trial by jury to England. A century of innovation in shipbuilding climaxed in the great dragon ships, vessels which could cross oceans or sail up fjords and rivers. This technological achievement, one of the brightest of the age, allowed them to establish a sophisticated trading network stretching from Baghdad to the coast of North America. But perhaps the greatest Viking trait was not their martial or navigational skills, but their remarkable adaptability. They had a genius for absorbing whatever local traditions they encountered, combining them into new and dynamic forms. In France, these filthiest of God's creatures created the model chivalric state. In Iceland, they set up a republic based on individual rights, and in Russia, they became autocratic defenders of orthodoxy. Where there were no native foundations to build on, the Vikings showed a willingness to experiment, combined with a stubborn practicality. They claimed that Odin himself had advised that no better burden can a man carry on the road than a store of common sense. In Iceland, in particular, there were plenty of opportunities to put this belief into practice. When changing ecological conditions made it apparent that they would have to abandon some of their rights, they held a vote, deciding to willingly place themselves under the Norwegian crown. In the same gathering, they agreed to adopt Christianity, although the majority were still pagan, in order to avoid a religious war. The Christian Icelanders, in turn, preserved their pagan past, faithfully recording both Norse mythology and the exploits of their heathen ancestors. This Viking pragmatism flowed back to Scandinavia as well. Canute introduced Anglo-Saxon-style coins to the Viking homelands and distributed them by means of a government that was based in part on a Byzantine model. The knowledge of southern agriculture and social institutions that returning Vikings brought back with them transformed Scandinavia even more than the wealth that accompanied it. But the most far-reaching change was a result of Christianity, imported from continental sources as far apart as Rome and Russia. What was true of physical distance also spanned the spiritual spectrum of the new faith. St. Olaf had kinsmen across Europe. He was baptized in Catholic Rouen and took shelter in Orthodox Novgorod. The very alienness of the Vikings to the modern world is, in a way, a testament to their adaptability. The Norse homelands today are model social democracies, known for their stability, order, and unflappable citizens. Their flags all proudly display a cross, and instead of raiding, they hand out peace prizes. They could hardly be more different than the brutal and bloodthirsty pagan warriors who overturned the medieval world. And yet there is something bewitching about that vanished age, with its blend of exotic beauty and violence, its cunning raiders and wild, untamed adventurers. The pull they still exert can be seen all around us, from cruise ships to NASA probes named Viking, from common nautical terms to town names that end with Beck in France or By in England. 3 of the days of the week are named after Viking gods, and a Viking king's name graces Bluetooth, the ubiquitous wireless technology that connects our phones and computers. Perhaps it is a longing for, as a nameless exile once mused in the Anglo-Saxon poem The Wanderer, a time that has grown dark under cover of night, as if it had never been. Or perhaps it is a resonance with individuals who pitted themselves against the world and, for 2.5 centuries, carried all before them. Either way, one suspects that the Vikings themselves would be pleased with their enduring reputation. All men are mortal, they were fond of saying. Only a noble name can live forever. This concludes The Sea Wolves by Lars Brownworth, narrated by Joe Barrett. Copyright 2014 by Crux Publishing Limited. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Crux Publishing and was produced in the year 2015 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.